Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is again United States penetration of Brazil. I'm glad you could join us today. United States penetration of Brazil, a book by Jan Knippers Black. I love to do these presentations. I think they're, an excellent way of reviewing the government of the United States. It is a racist group of murderers. It is a racist group of torturers. We wanted to just talk for a few minutes about their torture campaign across the world in preparation for this. We want to know why the U.S. government likes torture. We don't understand the whole basis of this torture thing. They sell this technology all over the world. They sell the technology to torture the people of, Indochina, of South America, of Central America, and of Africa. They sell it to governments. They actually use it against their own citizens. We wonder why they do that. Anyone who gives, proper presentations on YouTube, who discusses things honestly and, sincerely, like factual books like this book, United States Penetration of Brazil, or the other books that I go on. They like to torture. They like to, show that they're able to stop that democracy. We would wonder why other governments, other people, other than the United States of America, likes to, do these kinds of things. European governments, we have never had an issue with them, doing these sorts of things. We have never had an issue with Africans or Southeast Asia doing these sorts of things. We just wonder why the United States government cannot allow free thought on its, independent media outlets. And why do they resort to torture and murder to avoid that, to avoid addressing these things? Why do they why do they resort to torture and murder to, cause, stoppage of, communication of books like United States Penetration of Brazil, against the crime of silence, Indochina wars, post-war Indochina and the reconstruction of imperial ideology? Yeah, I believe because they are, obsessed murderers. It is a group of mafia, gangsters that love to, just kill people, that love to kill people and love to, torture people with, amputations and feel better when they're able to say that we did what we did because we're good at it. Right? I mean, mafia is, a criminal organization that murders people and that kills people. And it's a secretive organization that doesn't tell what it's actually about. And the secret of American government is similar to the mafia. It is a racist group that likes to, target colored people of the third world with all sorts of financial theft, murder, torture, all of the stuff. We've read about it. We've read about it in the Indochina wars. We've read about it in, they're turning the tide. Latin America, Central American intervention. This is a trait of the U.S. government. I strongly believe that they are a group of murderers. They are a group of murderers and mafia gangsters that don't really respect the rule of law. They don't respect any nations. They just respect, the power of the machine gun, the power of the oppressive machine gun to ruin people. It is just reflected by all of their systems, but the power of the machine gun, the brutalization of their military, the brutalization of the U.S. Congress and its police departments, the brutalization of all of their people is just an example of the power of the American machine gun to resolve disputes rather than talking things through. I mean, we went through democracy yesterday and how democracy is made by, open debate and competition. The U.S. government doesn't allow that. They are racist butchers. And that's what they are. We have to just understand that this is the goal of the U.S. government is to make people, unhappy, unable to express themselves, and then just, shoot to kill and say that we're in charge now. Right? I mean, the way they did it in, Venezuela, the way they did it in Iran, the way they murdered people. It's important to read books like this. It's important to understand these books and go through them and, meticulously understand what happened in these conflicts because the U.S. government repeats itself over and over. And if you know what they did in the past, you know their future. Okay, their past history indicates a group of, mafia war criminal murderers. Okay, war criminal murderers. We said yesterday, Johnson, Nixon, Kissinger, McNamara and Rusk should have been hanged for their crimes. They committed crimes and they should have been hanged the same way the Nazis were hanged in Germany after World War II. The American government hanged these Nazi criminals. They didn't hang their Nazi-type murderous war criminals, Johnson, Nixon, McNamara, Rusk, and Kissinger. None of them they hanged. So that is what we think is important. We think it's important to discuss these things. They can, go off on, mental health. They can go off on all sorts of reasons. But we believe that this is the best thing. So I'm going to talk today about the last chapters. It's about 60 pages. We'll be finished with it in, 2.5 hours, I believe. But I hope you can, sit through it. I'm glad you could join us today. All right, so we're going to get started here. United States penetration of Brazil, Jan Knapper's Black. Please download the Google Drive link. It's a PDF of the book. I highly recommend you read it because it is an example of U.S. colonial fascist, mafia, gun-violent, murderous action in Latin America. The mafia, American government, gun-violent, racist, murderous gangsters conducted a military dictatorship and right-wing takeover of Brazil in 1964, coup d'etat under Lyndon Johnson. Just give me 1 second. I think I have a... So we discussed 3 chapters yesterday. The U.S. and Brazilian military elites, the institutional ambient of the military, and the implications of the Cold War worldview. We learned about the gun-violent American white war criminal murderers who supported the police brutality training in Latin America and provided the appropriate torture techniques to the Brazilian military to severely repress the population. This was because the fascist American machine gun murder war criminals could not accept civilian supremacy in Brazil. They needed a close-knit group of military elites to provide them with free capital of the Brazilian resources and to prevent the Brazilian people from furthering democracy and preventing a machine gun military government. The United States military is known for its inability to accept civilian or popular democratic opinion. It has over and over acted as judge and jury in lands in which it has not been solicited and never allowed debate or civilian discussion for the sake of betterment of the country's problems. The U.S. brutal police, white American terrorists, are agents of its military establishment and are responsible for major subversion in Latin America. They were intricately involved with police training programs, include those which were used to infiltrate the civilian state governments of Brazil and resulted in a coup of the federal government of Goulart. The state governments were very much pushing for reform of the Brazilian people, whereas the U.S. terrorist police, white murderers, felt that it is a fascist machine gun government that the Brazilian people deserve. This is what they have always been, a group of racist white technocrats and machine gun violent fascists who do not involve themselves in discussion with civilians and are simply agents of racist violence against people's best interests. The racial profiling manual was discussed in the U.S. Marine Corps' Small Wars Manual. They also furthered the ambitions of a few military elites who were not interested in the people, but were interested in their self-serving interests and very loyal to the racist white rapists and murderers of the U.S. Congress who were interested only in stealing Brazilian money through its resources without giving them any returns. The economist Celso Furtado made clear that the Brazilian military generals were being indoctrinated with American fascist colonial military security doctrine which is highly murder prone because the whites of the American Congress are highly violent murderers. This indoctrination pushed forth that the military are to view themselves as the sole political entity and to not accept any civilian political party as valid. And anyone who is against the dissents, against the small-minded white murderers of Washington were shot, a formula for economy in Brazil, were shot dead by the gun-violent Americans and their Brazilian military fascist murderers. Political debate and open competition were not allowed by the American murderous war criminals, as they did not allow these things in order to have a complete machine gun control of the Brazilian people. They lied and peddled propaganda that democracy at work was the goals of the U.S., while the power and opulence of the U.S. military was stressed, pushing the military away from civilian discussions of the consensual process of genuine debate and competition in democratic societies. General Sykes was chairman of the American delegation for JBUSMC and was in favor of the coup because Goulart was a communist. He was again lying, as most American advisors indicate that Goulart was not a communist, but posed a threat to U.S. interests due to his nationalization of oil goals. Every Democratic popular call for reform conjured up the Cold War psychology of communism and that only military people who are immune to the vagaries of civilian politics could discipline the economy and populace and achieve economic development. Thus, the U.S. machine gun white murder and war criminal fascists were not at all in the democratic arena in Brazil, but were 100% a fascist dictatorship. The number of political murders is a testament to U.S. blatant disregard for human rights of third world Brazilians, many of whom were starved or imprisoned or murdered by the U.S. policies. This irrational communist obsession kept the Brazilian people in a state of terror for the duration of the dictatorship. The communist worldview was shown by Black in the book to result in the devastation of Brazil's economy in gun-violent fascist American military war criminals and its theft of the Brazilian resources of oil and denationalization, which they prevented from reversing and resulted in the racist white American capitalist failure in Brazil. So let's get started. Glad you can join us again. So, policy and operations. The Cold War worldview that has provided the ideologic framework for U.S. military operations since World War II has influenced the relations of the U.S. military elite with U.S. civilian policymakers, as well as with foreign military regimes. In this chapter, we examine some of the ways in which the U.S. military has explained its own role in the making, interpretation, and implementation of foreign policy, and some of the consequences of relatively unfettered U.S. military operations and influence in Brazil. We examine in particular the political implications inherent in the focus on counterinsurgency and civic action as proper and necessary roles for the military elites. We will note the unenhanced potential for counter-revolutionary violence in the hemisphere that lies in the transnational military cooperation and U.S. contingency planning. Two of the questions that need to be dealt with are who are the effective policymakers and what are their objectives or the national objectives as they see them, ? While the questions are far too large for the scope of this study, it might at least be suggested that an adequate answer is not likely to be found in the Constitution and laws of the United States, nor on any bureaucratic organization chart. The U.S. Congress has, of course, been involved in making policy toward Latin America, and the thrust of congressional involvement in the last several years has been toward placing restrictions on military assistance, but the distance from Capitol Hill to the Pentagon, to command headquarters in Panama, to the individual countries is very great, especially as it is apparent that many within the military hierarchy view limiting legislation as unwarranted interposition in their affairs. Senator Wayne Moores pointed out in 1968 hearings on amendments to the OAS Charter that the executive branch had gone so far as to get around the restrictions this committee has put on military aid in the annual foreign aid legislation by increasing our loans of military equipment to Latin America under the guise that the weapons are obsolete. In the 1969 hearings on military programs, Senator William Fulbright said, the committee tried its best to reduce these arms sales programs by putting restrictions upon credit. I thought we had succeeded in this action taken in the Congress, but the ingenuity of our bureaucracy is something to behold. It is almost impossible for a legislature to keep up with it. And Senator Frank Church, in the same hearings, added, against the combined opposition of the State Department, the Pentagon, and most often the White House, its elimination of military assistance is not easy to accomplish. 2 years ago, we finally ended the revolving fund on arms sales and attempted to reduce the size and scope of the military assistance program, but other methods have been found. It is like a hydra-headed monster. The attitude of the military toward legislative limitations was indicated in a 1968 speech by General Robert Porter, who said, "I am therefore concerned that the sharp cuts in MAP made by Congress will force governments to divert monies to defense that otherwise would have gone for economic and social programs. I explain these Latin American facts of life to members of Congress whenever I have the opportunity, but it is definitely upwater swimming when so many misconceptions about the area are so generally and sometimes so mischievously disseminated." Ralph Dungan, former special assistant to President Kennedy, expressed the belief that the current U.S. preoccupation with counterinsurgency represents an incomplete evolution of an intention on the part of the Kennedy administration to eventually disengage from significant military activity in Latin America. He maintained that the military assistance effort was refocused on counterinsurgency and civic action in an attempt to get away from tanks, planes, and ships. The weaning away from major armaments, Dungan says, was partly a reflection of Washington's perception of the security problem as it existed at the time, but partly a conviction that we ought to encourage a concentration on the development problems as the root cause of instability. He saw the basic defect of this tactic in the U.S. military perception of stability as an end in itself. A number of scholars have noted that a certain amount of social upheaval is probably inevitable and possibly essential to the resolution of grievances of marginal social sectors and to their entry into the political system as participants rather than subjects. Albert Hirschman, for example, said, to paraphrase Marx, decentralized, unrequited violence is frequently found in the role of indispensable midwife to reform. To advocate reforms in Latin America without tolerating, accepting, and sometimes even welcoming and promoting the only kinds of pressures which have proven to be effective in getting reforms is to risk being accused of hypocrisy and deception. The view present within the U.S. military, however, and apparently among U.S. civilian policymakers as well, has been that any manifestation of unrest is threatening to progress. An Air University Review article of September to October 1973 is illustrated of the scope of the responsibility assumed by the military. The new concept of counterinsurgency is therefore much broader than merely the defeat of overt communist guerrilla uprisings. The prevention of communist insurgency and the attainment of stability through progress are the goals of U.S. policies. It has frequently been observed in congressional testimony that the control supposedly exercised by the ambassador over all members of the country team exists only on paper, nor can higher echelons at the State Department necessarily expect to have the last word on policy matters of interest to the Pentagon. Jack Hood Vaughn related one of his encounters as follows. I confess that my unsuccessful efforts at reasoning with Pentagon brass on Canal Zone issues have caused me considerable frustration and disillusionment over the years. My last failure occurred one very hot afternoon in 1966 when, as Assistant Secretary of State, I was visiting the American Embassy in Panama. My innocuous objective was to convince the general in charge of the Southern Command that it was hardly in the U.S. interest to continue teaching napalm bombing to Latin American pilots. I pointed out that the first time a Latin American pilot dropped napalm on his own people, napalm he had been trained to mix and launch at a Canal Zone training course of the United States, the U.S. would be a totally indefensible position, not with just God and Bill Fulbright, but with the world as well. I made not a dent. General Eugene LeBailey he revealed his attitude on the matter to a Georgetown University audience in 1971 when he said that the major obstacle to harmonious relations between the United States and the Latin American countries was the persistent effort of Congress to interject itself into the conduct of military relations. He cited in particular the hearings on relations with Brazil scheduled by the Subcommittee on the American Republics of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Ralph Dungan has maintained that operations are, in fact, the tail wagging the dog of foreign policy, That is, operations generate policies that must be implemented through the continuation or expansion of those operations. Joseph Novitsky in April 1971 quoted a Colombian officer as conceding that military assistance created some of its own needs. On May 5, 1971, President Nixon announced that he was exercising his authority to waive the $75 million annual ceiling set by Congress in 1967 on arms aid to Latin America, alleging that the waiver of the was important to the security interests of the United States. Representative Dante Fasol, chairman of the Subcommittee on Inter-American Affairs of House Foreign Affairs Committee, suggested that the announcement was made at the end of the fiscal year in order to avoid congressional review. The value of U.S. military assistance and sales to Brazil increased sharply thereafter, according to aid, from $800,000 in fiscal year 1970 to $12,100,000 in 1971 to $20,800,000 in 1972. Attempting to justify the waiver, a senior official of the Nixon administration said, "There is no point in having United States military training missions in the hemisphere if there is less and less American equipment to train with." One of the original arguments for the training missions was that when they were needed to teach the Latin Americans how to use U.S. equipment, now it is being argued that the equipment is needed because the training missions are there. Some unnamed Nixon administration officials conceded that one of the purposes of the waiver of the congressional ceiling on arms aid in 1971 was to open Latin American markets to U.S. arms manufacturers. Under Defense Department regulations, U.S. military advisors are in fact mandated to cooperate with private industry in promoting the sales of American arms abroad. Under the authorization of Public Law 87-195, Section 505B, 4th September 1961, the Latin American Military Assistance Program for the first time stressed internal security and civic action. The training, further elaborated in 1963, was to concentrate on riot control, counter-guerrilla operations and tactics, intelligence, public information, psychological warfare, and counterinsurgency. Senator Morse introduced an amendment for the Foreign Assistance Act of 1963, providing that internal security requirements shall not, unless the President determines otherwise, and promptly reports such determinations to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, be the basis for military assistance programs for the American republics. Although the amendment was still in effect, about half the Latin American military assistance program was earmarked for internal security purposes. In 1964, the option of presidential waiver, incorporated into most foreign assistance legislation since 1956, has served to nullify most congressional prohibitions. The broad political and socioeconomic scope encompassed in the reorientation toward internal security and civic action constitutes what Alfred Stefan has designated the new professionalism, a phenomenon which he sees developing within the United States, as well as the Latin American military establishments. George Lodge has pointed out that there was no reason to believe that a professional and well-trained Latin American military would participate less in domestic politics. Our U.S. experience, Lodge said, is exactly the reverse. Jose Nunn noted that by definition, programs of counterinsurgency erase the limits between the spheres of military and political competence. He maintained that since the adversary cannot be clearly recognized, his identification depends on the military operations themselves. Thus, Nunn held political intervention becomes a justifiable professional role for the military. The justification is found in the principles of counterinsurgency as outlined by U.S. Army official Slavko N. Blejglak. The author noted that in counterinsurgency, military strategy and tactics cannot be dissociated from political and social measures, for the enemy seeks to impair not only the military potential of a government, but also its administrative machinery, political support, and oral sanction. He said there can be only one commander-in-chief at the head of a wholly unified counterinsurgency command structure. And he suggested that in some case, for example, where there is a lack of capable and honest civilian officials, it may be necessary to integrate a country's civil administration into its military structure. A contributor to the Military Review in 1970 described subversive war as consisting largely of the impact which agents of communist subversion can develop at all levels of human activity: political, economic, intellectual, psychological, and military. As there is no apparent limit to what may be defined as subversive activity, neither is there any apparent limit to the methods for or priority assigned to encountering it. The article explained that before the guerrilla structure could be destroyed, the intelligence services must infiltrate the guerrilla organization. By working among the subversives in their own environment, the task of suppression will be simplified. In the CIA and cult of intelligence, former CIA official Victor Marchetti revealed that in 1969, the CIA had successfully infiltrated the Brazilian guerrilla organization headed by Carlos Marighella. The agency had advanced information that an airline hijacking was to take place, but it failed to issue a warning and abort the hijacking because to do so would have exposed its infiltrators and placed in a higher priority on trapping Marighella. The Civic Actions Program, although it did not constitute the major effort in terms of funds appropriated, was given a big propaganda buildup in the early 1960s in order to indicate the commitment of the military, U.S. and Latin America, for development. But a guide to military action, civic action, compiled in 1969 by the 30th Civil Affairs Group, revealed the inherent contradictions involved in presenting a liberal rationale for an essentially conservative program. Without denying the value of irrigation ditches, roads, rural schools, and the like, one might ask if the military is the proper institution to undertake this role. Edward Glick, a researcher for the Systems Development Corporation, noted in 1964 that the military effort in teaching youngsters was the second largest civic action operation in Latin America, and General Seitz confirmed that the Brazilian military was operating grade schools in areas that were being opened up and developed. He saw lack of education as a serious problem for Brazil because people can't operate complex machines such as computers if they can't read the instructions. Not only are military functionaries thereby denying such jobs to civilians, but they are placing themselves in a position to mold the political values of future generations. If the same activities were being carried out by the church or by a political party, for example, the political implications would be obvious. Indeed, the implications were quite obvious to the Brazilian military itself in the early 1960s when basic education under the Paulo Freire and similar methods was being offered by groups with a very different view of the nature and function of education. David Bulbrough has contended that the governments best suited the realization of the ideal of civic action are those already best qualified to meet popular aspirations. Civic action, even of the ideal type, Bulbrough insisted, weakens civilian authority as it increases the ability of the military to have behave autonomously, and as it establishes the military as an intermediary between civilian leaders and local constituencies. He noted, however, that the probability that the military will accept the grubby tasks of village-level modernization and refrain from demands for significant authority in development programs declines with acquisition of complex mechanical and administrative skills. Furthermore, if a standard of combat excellence predominates, military personnel tend to reject civic action as irrelevant to their mission or even as a deliberate attempt by civilian officials or U.S. advisors to demean the indigenous armed forces. In fact, the small-scale developmental tasks apparently envisioned by Kennedy administration civilians tended to be rejected by both the U.S. military advisors and Brazilian officers. General Edson do Figueiredo, the former aide to Castelo Branco in the Italian campaign, who was sent to Washington immediately after the 1964 coup to cement relations, complained to Colonel Edward King. "We are not Boy Scouts," King maintained, that regardless of the intent of civilian policymakers, the basic purpose of civic action, both for U.S. officers and foreign ones, was counterinsurgency. The upgrading of the military's image through involvement in civic action or nation building has been a major U.S. objective. Defense Secretary McNamara told the House Foreign Affairs Committee on June 8, 1961, civic action must be compatible with the military missions of these forces. This is not a covert use of the military channel for economic purposes, But where the mission is, wholly or in large part, one of the internal security, we know that the armed forces will do a better job if they are identified with civic progress. While the military in most Latin American countries has been apparently failed to enhance its image with local populations, applications for enrollment in Brazil's military academies, for example, have dropped precipitously. The institution's extensive training and involvement in traditionally civilian matters appears to have enhanced its self-image. One dissident retired U.S. General, Bonner Fuellers, reported to the House Foreign Affairs Committee that when U.S.-trained Latin American officers return home, their governments appear inadequate, sluggish, and antiquated. They find U.S. dollar handouts have bred corruption in high places. They form a clique separate and apart from others. Convinced that they could run their country for far better than their present chief of state, they plot his overthrow. With weapons and training which we have provided, they have the means to take over the government by force. Thus, our military assistance programs are creating potential military dictatorships. Each of the U.S. officers whom this author interviewed stressed the development of self-confidence as a major contribution of U.S. military training to the Brazilian officer corps. In this connection, Stepan observed that the willingness of the Brazilian military to return the country to civilian rule following previous coups could be attributed in part to its own sense of inadequacy for the task. The conspirators who toppled the constitutional government of 1964, however, were convinced that the military was the only institution capable of running the government. The point of view has apparently been shared by U.S. officers. Of Brazil in 1964, Lieutenant Commander Han, for example, said, "The first order of business for Branco was to oust or restrict those individuals who proved the greatest threat or impedance to his energetic and idealistic program. A supreme command of the revolution was formed, and it asked Congress to take some necessary but extraordinary measures. When Congress hesitated, the command promulgated the first institutional act." In a paper that examines the tools the military leaders found compelled to use against the lethargic Congress and a wholly corrupted and communist infiltrated political system, Lieutenant Colonel Stockton expressed his opinion of those leaders as follows. The active institution actually reduced the Congress to a rubber stamp of the president. Brazil was extremely fortunate to have a far-sighted man of General Branco's caliber wielding this type of power. Political scientists will argue as to whether this type of power was necessary, but the fact remains that a powerful force was necessary to reform the Brazilian houses of Congress. The military of Brazil represents a well-organized and efficient bureaucracy. They are probably the best educated and most unified of all the forces in operation in Brazil. Because of their training and discipline, they probably surpass their civilian counterparts in many administrative skills. This talent is being utilized to great advantage by the government in the present revolutionary stabilization and reform period. Likewise, U.S. Army Colonel Milton Calero has maintained that the Brazilian military was the only group qualified to develop the country. He said that the only alternatives to open to civilian government in 1964 were rule by the oligarchy and the rule by the left, either of which would have inhibited development. Colonel Edward King noted that in many cases, Brazilian officers, through U.S. training, did indeed become more highly skilled in technical and managerial matters than their civilian counterparts. Thus, having contributed to this imbalance in the first place, U.S. military spokesmen in congressional testimony have persistently justified support for military governments and argued for increases in military assistance because of the role of the Latin American military as educators and managers in all walks of life. The House Special Study Mission reported in 1970 that proponents of MAP training pointed to the effective communications of anti-insurgency dogma in several thousand countries and increased levels of efficiency and professionalism in armed forces, which have been aided as evidence of the program's success. General Porter has written that, in addition to improving the image of the armed forces, civic action has contributed to the internal security by denying safe havens to insurgent groups in remote areas and by improving the intelligence collecting capabilities of the internal security forces. The 14 observation posts installed during the Castelo Branco regime, manned by U.S. technicians and equipped with scanning devices, no doubt enhanced Brazilian intelligence gathering capabilities. But as the sense of being under siege escalated, new measures appeared to be required. Thus, in 1968, with the strong encouragement of U.S. military advisors, the Brazilian government initiated Operation Presence, whereby military units were spread more evenly across the entire national territory, and especially into the areas deemed to be potential targets for insurgents. The military hoped to be able not only to suppress the existing revolutionary activity, but also, by its mere presence, to discourage potential insurgency. Examining the political change in Latin America, George Lodge has said, there is good reason to doubt that the truly macho Latin American soldier who has learned to fight with the latest U.S. weapons in U.S. Army and Special Forces training programs will be satisfied with only good works. It is quite probable that he will respond much more enthusiastically to fighting guerrillas and revolutionaries wherever they may be. So Lodge argued this shield against insurgency presumably will seek and expect insurgents against which to exercise itself. Who these insurgents are likely to be, says Lodge, will vary from country to country and from rural to urban areas. In rural Honduras, he found that an insurgent was anyone a landowner could identify as troublesome. This particularly included rural union organizations, and peasants generally feared reprisal from military authorities for attending campesino meetings. Herbert Klein has observed that in a study of Bolivian politics that we've trained Bolivian special forces to fight insurgents, but they use their training to massacre mine workers or put down student disorders. Writing on the U.S. military assistance program, General Porter warned, communism has made impressive and dangerous penetration in many fields, notably among youth and in educational, informational media, and trade union spheres. It is relentlessly waging warfare against established societies in Latin America, as well as in our own country. Their battleground is across the whole spectrum of national life and activity. Communism is engaged in protracted conflict. Violence is but one string of its bow. Its strategists have increasingly emphasized that power can be won and influence gained through political, economic, and psychological warfare. If insurgents then are to be found across the whole spectrum of national life and working within the system, how are they to be identified? Perhaps they may be tagged through the opinions they express. Lieutenant Colonel Stockton noted that in Brazil in early 1964, subversives took keen advantage of a free press, and Major Weirs explained that the efforts of the communists have been to portray the United States as a money-grubbing country and not as a democratic symbol. Weirs said that the communists who had infiltrated the labor movement and other phases of Brazilian life supported goulart against the military and against the United States. Stepan noted that the Sorbonne group considered any criticism of the United States to be subversive. Likewise, a contributor to the Brazilian Revista de Club Militar in 1973, having noted that more than ever before, we are seeing the development of two moral poles, that of good and that of evil, asserted that the criminal intent of the National Student Union was made obvious in particular by the intensification of its campaign against the hemispheric policies and prestige of the United States. It would probably be impossible to ascertain whether the views held by Brazilian and U.S. officers as to the identity of the insurgents in Brazil and the measures that should be taken to counter them originated with the Brazilians or with their North American counterparts. But it is apparent that the views of the two military establishments have generally been compatible. In his 1968 speech, General Porter said, in order to facilitate coordinated employment of internal security forces within and among Latin American countries, we are also endeavoring to foster inter-service and regional cooperations by assisting in the organization of integrated command and control centers, the establishment of common operating procedures, and the conduct of joint and combined training exercises. The idea of expanded military cooperation within Latin America has had considerable appeal among like-minded military rulers, exalting the accords between the military establishment of Argentina and Brazil in 1965. General Juan Carlos Onganía of Argentina referred to a military America which has not only a mechanical but a mental system of communication. The 1964 coup in Brazil and the 1966 coup in Argentina clearly alleviated some of the anxieties of President Stroessner of Paraguay. A 1969 report of the Paraguayan Ministry of the Interior claimed the cooperation and reciprocity that existed between the security forces of Paraguay and their counterparts in Brazil and Argentina. Colonel Roberto Cubas of the Paraguayan army informed the author that the military intelligence services of the three countries meet regularly to coordinate the plans and activities, and that Stroessner's secret police, unpopularly known as the PIAGs, are allowed to move freely in Brazil and Argentina to apprehend or conduct surveillance on Paraguayan exiles. The attempt following the Dominican crisis of 1965 to expand inter-American military cooperation even more through the establishment of a permanent inter-American peacekeeping force had a chilly reception in most of the Latin American countries. It was conceived by some U.S. officials as an extension of the counterinsurgency program. Foreign Service Officer Raymond Barrett, for example, expressed the opinion that it would be desirable to adapt each U.S. military assistance program to help equip and develop each country's unit, which would be maintained in a high state of readiness. Barrett suggested that the orientation of the armed forces of the American nations toward an internal security function of peacekeeping would help them in countering potential or actual subversion in their own countries. The permanent inter-American peacekeeping force died of boring, but there remained sufficient show of force in the hemisphere at the disposal of the U.S. military and its counter-revolutionary allies to inhibit the squeamish potential revolutionary. In case that the deterrent should fail and the U.S. military should feel compelled to intervene in order to quell insurgency, there would be a number of U.S. military units in a state of readiness to handle any contingency. In fact, Admiral LaRoe noted that the long-term joint strategic objectives plan calls for the restructuring of offensive strategic forces for contingencies in the Third World. He added that the United States is the only country in the world that has the entire globe divided up into commands, and that these are contingency plans for the evacuation of U.S. citizens from every country. Kenneth Boulding has observed that technological and organizational advances have made it possible for decision makers to make and implement with maximum speed and efficiency decisions that should not have been made in the first place. U.S. Army and Air Force spokesman for the Joint Strike Command, since renamed Readiness Command, admonished in 1962, "We will have to prepare a plan for any possible mission the Joint Chiefs might assign to us." And they asserted the U.S. Strike Command provides this country with a highly mobile, hard-hitting military team of any size required, a highly trained professional force capable of reacting with selective military power to any threat which faces this nation anywhere on the globe. USAF General Joe Kelly said in 1963 that the Cuban Missile Crisis has demonstrated the value of military air transport services, worldwide command and control system, and demonstrated again that in any emergency situation, MATS is often the first to go. Kelly noted that, like the scores of other contingency plans that the Joint Chiefs of Staff require for possible major military actions in any part of the world, the Caribbean area plans were maintained under the constant review to keep them current. As another example of the usefulness and efficiency of MATS, he cited an incident in November 1962. MATS had been called upon to come to the rescue of the Creole Petroleum Company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, in Venezuela, which had become the victim of communist sabotage. Responsiveness to any degree of emergency, he added, can exist only to the extent that MATS and a full-time active duty member of the defense team is D-Day ready every day. For MATS, in effect, the only operational difference between war and peace is one of degree, not of kind. The scope of the contingency planning is suggested by a U.S. Air Force research project for which a team at Harvard University was bidding in 1963 to 1964 as part of an in-depth study of Latin America. Joseph Page was asked to be the field man of Northeast Brazil to determine how various sectors of the local populace would react to an invasion and occupation by foreign troops. Admiral LaRoque observed that counterinsurgency plans provide the rationale for building up and readying forces, and Colonel King added that the pressure in the intelligence community to resort to worst possible case analysis heightens the probability that those forces will be used. General Porter has warned that Latin America threatens to become another Vietnam unless the United States helps armed forces there provide a shield against insurgency while governments build a stable society. The implications of that statement go beyond the proposition that insurgency might reach such proportions that local authorities could not repress it to the suggestion that in such eventuality, U.S. forces would be obligated to step in. Likewise, a Spanish language training manual used at the Fort Bragg complex in the 1960s advised foreign trainees to accept modest numbers of foreign military and civilian counterinsurgency advisors in order to avoid the introduction of large foreign armies, which would make the indigenous regime appear to be a puppet government. And a 1967 field manual stated that when a host country army is able to contain insurgent forces, U.S. Army units might be sent in. The threats of or reassurances contained in such statements are lost neither on authorities nor on dissidents. A lecturer at the ESG in 1973 said that the United States considers that to adopt the principle of non-intervention would be to give advantage to the Soviet bloc. And Archbishop Dom Helder Camara has warned, if there should appear in any part of the world, but above all in Latin America, an outbreak of violence, they can be certain that immediately the great powers will arrive, even without a declaration of war, and we will have a new Vietnam. It has been argued that the U.S. military, imbued with its own concept of global mission, has been inclined to interpret legislation and executive intent and to conduct its own operations as it sees fit. Thus, whatever civilian policymakers might have viewed as the objective of counterinsurgency and civic action programs, these programs have been conducted in Brazil, among other countries, in such a way as to expand the political role and enhance the political power of the military. At the same time, the promotion of higher education in the management and technology of foreign military officers has provided them with the self-confidence required for a governing elite. Finally, it may be assumed that their self-confidence and disinclination to compromise with civilians is further bulwarked by the belief that their control over their own national societies is underwritten by the readiness of the U.S. military to intervene on their behalf at a moment's notice. So that's good. That's the chapter, policy and operations. Pretty straightforward. The last paragraph summarizes it best. The U.S. Congress is a military warmonger group of white mafia, murderous, war criminal gangsters. Okay, we saw their, interest, their involvement in the, counterinsurgency and their Latin American, involvements. They are, highly biased and highly promote U.S. government military machine. They are military overseers. They are racist white, mafia, murderous, war criminal butchers. And that is what they are. We saw all of the stuff about the U.S. Congress and its involvement in Latin America. President Nixon waived some of the different monies that were required. He had more arms. So that was the thing. The Congress is involved. The second thing we learned is that the civic action programs, basically the U.S. government's approach to, individual. Excuse me, 1 second. I'm going to just, shut off my. The U.S. government's approach is, to just, it's a group of, murderous butchers. They are murderous butchers. They are, look, we could see here that the civilian debate, the civilian democratic process, the United States throws it in the trash. They're fascist, racist frauds. They throw it in the trash more for the people of South America and the third world than for their own people. They cater to their own whites in the United States very well. They give them democracy, but they don't give third world people anything other than racist murder and racist torture. That is what they are about across the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that civilian policymakers made many statements But the U.S. government was always ready to promote weapons and machine guns to the Brazilian military. So if you promote machine guns to a group of military elites, you are going to get machine gun murder. That is what the United States government continues to do. And that is what they do. And even though people tell them, they still do it because they are a mafia group of criminal murderers. Okay, a mafia group of criminal murderers is the United States government, including its Congress and its presidents. And that is why they do it. And finally, they wanted to promote higher education, for the people, rather than discuss it with civilians, disinclination to compromise with civilians. The generals were relied on the fact that the U.S. would come to their aid and slaughter the people, just like they do all across the world. They did it in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, in Indonesia. They did it all over South America. These are racist, murderous American, white, mafia, butcher, genocidal war criminals. Okay, that's ultimately what it is, and we went through it. So let's continue. Institutional interest and defense strategy. Secretary of Defense McNamara's 1962 proposition that a policy of promoting democratic attitudes among the Latin American officer corps should be implemented by putting Latin American officers into extensive contact with their U.S. counterparts presupposed that the predominant direction of influence would be from the U.S. civilian policymakers and U.S. officers to the Latin American officers. Senator Frank Church has concluded that the reverse is more commonly the case. During the 1969 hearings on U.S. military policies and programs in Latin America, before the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Church suggested that our own personnel are being influenced by Latin American viewpoints rather than vice versa. He said that he had been disturbed by the extent to which American military officers located in these countries come to espouse and to parrot the viewpoints of the local military people. Certainly, the exertion of influence, excuse me 1 second, I'm going to just be right there, just shut it off. Certainly, the exertion of influence is not unidirectional. The U.S. officers function, in effect, as liaison between the U.S. civilian policymakers and the Latin American military establishments. On balance, then, do the U.S. officers serve U.S. civilian policymakers when and if the latter advocate democratic government, or do they serve the Latin American military establishment as lobbyists for political backing and for the instruments of power? This author is not convinced that the predominant direction of influence can be empirically established, but a more significant factor to be considered is that the individual and institutional self-interest. From this perspective, it is argued in this chapter that the interests of the U.S. and Latin American officers are complementary or similar, if not identical. That the U.S. military establishment has an interest in expanding its own operations is self-evident. The competition among the services, and more recently, the many varieties of special forces and operations, has only intensified that institutional imperative. General W.B. Palmer wrote of the military assistance program in 1962, "Well, good heavens, we all consider it important to have a base of influence in every country we can. And if a little equipment, a few aircraft, and some invitations to our service schools made this possible, what earthly objection can there be, ? Colonel Edward King has written that it was the limited war role in the underdeveloped countries that the Army saw its brightest prospects. To justify involvement in places where aggression against freedom did not reach the level of a bushfire war, he argues the counterinsurgency dimension was added. King maintains that from what he read, saw, heard, and participated in on the staff of the Joint Chiefs in the late 1960s, the Joint Chiefs policy was to use U.S. military power to answer to every question worldwide problem. He has the answer to every worldwide problem. The U.S. military power was the answer to every worldwide problem. They acted like executives charged with expanding the base of a business. This enthusiasm for the expansion of the duties of the services and their special groups through new instruments and rationales is particularly manifest in military journals of the early and mid 1960s, before the Vietnam War became a raging national controversy. The following article titles are exemplary. Accent on Cold War capabilities, counterinsurgency in your business, win friends, defeat communism, civic action helps counter the guerrilla threat. These are all from the Army Information Digest. Appearing before the Senate hearings on the Mutual Security Act of 1958, Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy reported that the U.S. missions, by the terms of their agreements, were responsible to the host government to which they were assigned, and that this is the capacity that in this capacity, the missions constituted an integral part of the advisory and training echelons of the host country. He maintained that in fulfilling their role, they advised on every aspect of the respective military programs and were most influential in advising on the acquisition of new material and on the varied aspects of training. Of the 584 military personnel assigned to missions in 19 Latin American countries in 1958, 436 were accredited to and received compensation ranging from $240 to $4,500 annually from the governments for which they were assigned. The apparent conflict of interest involved in this arrangement aroused congressional criticism, and the practice was halted by legislation on April 1st, 1959. Nevertheless, the House Foreign Affairs Committee's Special Study Mission to Latin America reported in 1970 that transportation to and from Brazil for U.S. Navy officers and enlisted men and their dependents, along with household goods and automobiles, was still provided by the Brazilian government under the terms of the 1922 agreement. Members of the mission were also granted free entry for articles for personal and family use, and the mission chief was provided with an automobile and a driver. All U.S. Navy officers assigned to the mission were considered senior to Brazilian officers of the same rank. The Brazilian government continued to fulfill these half-century-old conditions on the grounds that the U.S. naval mission is an adjunct of the Brazilian Navy. Similar provisions have bind the U.S. Army and Air Force missions to the Brazilian military establishment. An obvious aspect of the interest of foreign officers in training and other relations with the U.S. military has been pointed out by Colonel DeForest Ballou. Assistance can only come from one or two places. If you know how it works, you're better off. If you were a Brazilian officer, how could you plan on any action without knowing how the U.S. does things? Ballou also observed that the sharpest third world guys are going where the action is, that is, to the military rather than civilian careers, and to U.S. rather than European schools. Some military insiders have observed that in general, U.S. officers assigned to Miller groups in Latin America were those whose careers had peaked. These officers naturally preferred the status and the plush offices and residences and other luxuries abroad to obscurity in a Pentagon cubbyhole or a stateside base. In order to justify their assignment and enhance their positions, they had to continue to perceive a security threat. Likewise, foreign officers, in order to acquire more weapons or support in overcoming immediate challenges to their power or prerequisites, also exaggerate the security threat. A Brazilian described as having been a high aide to the foreign minister prior to the 1964 coup told New York Times reporter Joseph Novitsky of a call he had received from the Minister of War. He asked me whether we were trying to abolish his ministry. He said that the United States military mission had told him it might be very difficult to get aid and supplies for the next year unless Brazil supported the United States. In fact, there was a decrease of over $9 million in deliveries to Brazil in 1963. A discontinuation of military aid would obviously have been a blow to the U.S. missions as well as to the Brazilian military. That Latin American military establishments have little to gain and much to lose through the democratization of their own countries is readily apparent. Numerous studies indicate that the percentage of national budgets allocated to defense tend to be up to twice as high in countries under military rule, and such studies only reveal the tip of the iceberg of the prerequisites accruing to a ruling elite. That the U.S. military stands to gain through the militarization of the countries over which the United States exercise hegemony is equally obvious. At the very least, this militarization affords all the tangible and intangible bonuses to United States officers of greater camaraderie with the ruling circles and greater prestige than State Department personnel enjoy. These bonuses include a larger role in U.S. policymaking as a result of more direct lines of communication with the centers of power and therefore supposedly more reliable information and greater leverage in influencing host country policies. They also include all the pettier prerequisites that accompany proximity to those in a power. These are amply demonstrated by the fact that in the late 1960s, the entertainment allowance of the military missions in Brazil was running about 17,900 annually, approximately 3 times that allotted to the ambassador. Military entertainment allowances for Latin America in fiscal 1970 actually exceeded the total for the rest of the world. And military rulers can be expected to heap honors on their military counterparts from benefactor countries. General Porter, for example, who maintains that our training programs are reaping such dividends, has twice been decorated by Brazil's military government. It also means a potent rationale for the continuation or expansion of U.S. military programs in the area. Colonel Milton Calero, Army attaché in Brasilia in the late 1960s, said, "The people who more and more are calling the shots in Latin America are the military." And he added that the military-to-military rapport is a fact, an indispensable channel of communication, and a link that Foreign Service officers could not fill. U.S. military officers have long been honorary members of the Brazilian-Chile military. The Brazilian club military, the House Special Study Mission noted in 1970, U.S. military personnel report being welcome at all activities of the Brazilian armed forces. Their advice is often solicited on military problems, and at times through personal contracts, individual U.S. representatives have been able to exert beneficial influence on authorities. On the question of camaraderie and prestige, Colonel Ballou maintained the informal relationship and the old school tie of the Fort Leavenworth experience is probably more important than the training itself. He added that it is possible for the U.S. military to influence the course of events in allied countries through such contracts, especially if U.S. officers have friends in power. We have ways of doing these things overt and covert. Many Brazilians are convinced that Colonel, later promoted to Brigadier General, Vernon Walters, had a great deal to do with prodding his close friend Castelo Branco into leading the 1964 coup. Brigadier General Vernon Walters. Celso Furtado maintained that U.S. military personnel provided a network of communication whereby Brazilian officers could be drawn into the conspiracy without openly committing themselves to overplaying their hands prematurely. Walters, Furtado said, was the focal point of this communications network. Colonel Edward King noted that the assessment of an impending communist takeover permeating communication channels from Brazil to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and back again represented for the U.S. officers, as for the Brazilian ones, an inextricable mix of conviction and self-interest. It would have been career suicide for any U.S. officer involved to express disagreement. It has been noted that on several occasions in the early 1960s, the State Department and Pentagon appeared to be pulling in opposite directions in the supposedly bilateral relations between the United States and various Latin American countries. In particular, on the occasions of the coups d'etat in Peru in 1962, the Dominican Republic and Honduras in 1963, and Bolivia in 1964, U.S. Embassy civilians appeared to be backing the sitting civilian governments while representatives of the military were encouraging the coup makers. Both advocates and opponents of the 1964 coup in Brazil see the period before and after that event as one in which U.S. policy, military and civilian, was exceptionally well coordinated. However, the portrayal of U.S.-Brazilian relations in the late 1960s that emerges from interviews with 3 well-positioned U.S. officers, Lieutenant Colonel Edward King, Joint Chiefs of Staff Delegate to the Joint Brazilian-U.S. Defense Commission in Washington, Colonel Milton Calero, Army Attaché in Brasilia, and Major General R.J. Seitz, Commander of the U.S. Delegation of the JBU-MSC, headquartered in Rio de Janeiro, is one of an alliance between the Brazilian government and the U.S. military against the U.S. ambassador and embassy civilians and some Brazilian politicians. Colonel King maintained that largely as a consequence of the communication channel linking the JBU-SMC directly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff Plans and Policy Division, The real policymaking and execution power of the military was much greater than that of the State Department. The military, King said, needs not and generally does not channel its communication through the embassy, and there is no way for State Department to get information the military doesn't want it to have. Furthermore, the Joint Chiefs of Staff only tell the civilian supporters at the State Department, at the Department of Defense, what they wish to tell. Colonel Calero said that whereas U.S. civilian diplomats were in a sense caught off guard or confounded by the 1968 consolidating coup, one who occupied his position with formal and, more importantly, informal contacts with military decision makers would have seen it as a direction in which the military could be expected to move. In fact, Calero had been told of the plans for the closing of Congress by some close friends who were aides to President Costa e Silva. He said that anyone in the position of guarding the security of the country would have had to be concerned about what might have happened had all the various groups plotting to overthrow the government coalesced. The Brazilian military and consistently the U.S. military, Calero said, had information that the Brazilian Congress didn't have about the real activities, connections, and schemes of Brazilian student leaders and others. He added that the same is true in the United States, where the military and the CIA, for example, have information on individuals that members of Congress couldn't be trusted with. Many of these student leaders who pretended to be concerned about conditions in the university cafeteria, Calero maintained, were actually part of a large-scale national and international network supported by the Soviet Union, among other countries, aimed at wars of national liberation. Whether or not members of Congress were involved, there were a lot of innocent and stupid ones. He added that a lot of people were tortured because of the shadow of suspicion that spread. It's best to get such movements under control before they get out of hand, he said. General Seitz said that the security threat to Brazil grew after the 1964 coup and had reached very serious proportions by 1967. This was one of the things that precipitated the takeover in 1968. He maintained that groups bent on overthrowing the government were organized nationally as well as internationally and were receiving support from Cuba and probably the Soviet Union and China as well. The conspiratorial network, he said, included the left wing of the Catholic Church, although the Catholics may not be aware of the real nature of the alliance. And Congressman Moreira Alves, if not a leader, was at least a spokesman of the conspirators. All of Brazil's embassies throughout the world were infiltrated by these people. That's why they're getting such a bad press. Meanwhile, according to General Seitz, from sometime in 1967 on and before the December 1960, and especially after 1968, the U.S. Embassy was anti-government. Ambassador Tuthill was having clandestine meetings with the opposition, specifically with Lacerda, and became a de facto persona non grata. President Costa e Silva allegedly called him in and confronted him with information about those meetings. That was Tuthill's last audience while he was in the country. Thus, Seitz says the embassy ceased to be able to function normally vis-a-vis the government and found it hard to collect information. The embassy apparently found it hard to collect information from the U.S. military. Seitz said that the Millet Group was the best source of intelligence, but that his predecessor had left the country early because he could not tolerate Tuthill. It was evident that Seitz did not find him easy to tolerate either. He added that the defense attaché, Colonel Arthur Mora, was probably the best informed person politically in the country at the time, but that Tuthill couldn't get much information from him because the two didn't see eye to eye. When communications between the embassy and the Brazilian government broke down, ties between the two military establishments helped to keep things going. This was possible in part, Seitz said, because of the inherently close relationship that developed through sharing offices with the Brazilian military hierarchy. Colonel Calero confirmed that competition between the State Department and the military was intense, and that the military was the usual channel for the transmission of delicate information. As a consequence of common institutional bonds, it was more comfortable for one military man to talk to another. He said, for example, that the Brazilian government's formulated but unannounced policy on the 200-mile limit for territorial waters was first outlined to him informally. He passed it on to the embassy. And Seitz added that although the embassy was supposed to be in charge of military sales, The Brazilians didn't expect cooperation from the civilians, so they asked him to intercede for them. At the aforementioned 1969 hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, G. Warren Nutter, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, asserted that among the benefits accruing to the United States from the military assistance group was the fact that they provide advice to our ambassadors as well as to the host countries. Questioned by Senator Church as to the nature of this advice, Nutter responded with a circuitous explanation that a major purpose in the mill group's presence was to keep the ambassador advised as to what they were doing there. The inference, stripped of bureaucratic double talk, was that the military assistance groups were there to fashion, sustain, and extend their own programs in perpetuity. Some perspective on the nature and direction of influence in the three-step linkage of U.S. civilian policymakers, U.S. officers, Brazilian officers can be gained by examining the advice that has been offered to U.S. policymakers by the U.S. officers. It appears that, in general, rather than urging democracy and submission to civilian leadership on their Brazilian counterparts, the United States officers have urged U.S. policymakers to accept or support military control of the government. General Robert Wood, Director of Military Assistance, argued in Senate Appropriations hearing in 1965 in favor of continued military assistance to Brazil on the grounds that there existed a vacuum in the civilian political structure so far as running the country is concerned, and the only force for stability and orderliness is the military. U.S. Navy Captain Raymond Toner explained in a 1968 article in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings that when the Latin American military performs the super missions role, for example, Toner was the overthrow of Argentina's civilian president Arturo Illia in 1966. It is reacting with the social and political body of its state, not as a foreign or separate entity upon it. He continued, the aspects of Spanish, Moorish, Jewish, Indian cultures will continue to influence Latin Americans. Their concepts of democracy will differ from democracy as we of North America conceive it. We then must outgrow our provincialism and adjust to a world-ranging viewpoint consistent with our responsibilities as a world power. And Lieutenant General Colonel Stockton advised that the United States, in its relations with Brazil, should soft-pedal criticism and demands for a true democratic government of the one man, one vote concept we have here. The overriding priority of our policy towards Brazil and all South America should be to foster stable governments that are Western-oriented. Likewise, in 1970, the Special Study Mission found U.S. officers in Brazil to be undisturbed about supporting an authoritarian government. U.S. military personnel whom we spoke with uniformly reported their relationship with the Brazilian counterparts to be warm and cordial. Mill group personnel and Brazilian officers as one of the best educated and informed social groups in the country, and more than any other group dedicated to national rather than regional or personal interests. Rather than dwell on the authoritarian aspects of the regime, they emphasize assertions by the Brazilian armed forces that they believe in and support representative democracy as an ideal and would return governments to civilian control if this could be done without sacrifice to security and development. This withdrawal from the political arena is not seen as occurring in the near future. For that reason, they emphasize the continued importance of the military assistance training program as a means of exerting U.S. influence and influencing and retaining the current pro-U.S. attitude of the Brazilian armed forces. Possible disadvantages to U.S. interest in being so closely identified with an authoritarian regime are not seen as particularly important. The Mill Group's lack of embarrassment about this identification with authoritarianism is apparent in their policy of cohabitation of headquarters. General Beatty confirmed in the 1971 Senate hearings that the joint headquarters of the U.S. and Brazilian delegations to the JBU-SMC in Rio de Janeiro was located in the Palacio Monroe, formerly the home of the Federal Senate. The headquarters of each of the U.S. service missions is located in the ministry building of its Brazilian counterpart. The NAVCOMTEC group, likewise, is located in the Navy Ministry. Beatty was questioned in the hearings about an Associated Press story regarding torture facilities on the floor of the Brazilian Navy Ministry, where the Naval Mission and the Navy COMTEC group are located. One American assigned to the floor reported having heard screams and groans over a 2-year period, and other U.S. personnel reported having seen Brazilians being dragged to and from the room by Brazilian naval agents. The AP account related that Admiral Hill had ordered his personnel not to discuss the subject. Asked if Hill had given such an order, Beatty replied that he had invoked a Navy regulation which requires that if there are things out of line in any organization, these facts be made known to the persons in the chain of command. And that is the same time they all said, I didn't know about it and I didn't talk to anybody about it. The special study mission reported that Miller Group personnel claimed that they exerted a restraining influence on the purchase of unnecessary military equipment since their advice is reputedly sought and valued by the Brazilians, but they were reportedly sympathetic to the Brazilians' feelings about U.S. attempts to limit the country's arms purchases. General Beatty explained in the 1971 hearings that exchanges of advices and opinions concerning the kinds of U.S. trainings that would be beneficial to the Brazilians evolved out of day-to-day context, but that the usual procedure was for the Brazilians to request a certain kind of training and for the missions to make arrangements for it to be provided. He affirmed that what the Brazilians did with the training that they received was quite outside his area of concern. American Republic Subcommittee Counsel Pat Holt noted in the hearings that topics from outlines submitted from the Defense Department of courses offered to Brazilians included censorship, checkpoint systems, chemical and biological operations, briefings on the CIA, civic action and civil affairs, clandestine operations, cryptography, defoliation, dissent in the United States, electronic intelligence, electronic warfare and countermeasures, and use of informants, insurgency and intelligence, counterintelligence, subversion, counter-subversion, espionage, counter-espionage, interrogation of prisoners and suspects, handling mass rallies and meetings, nuclear weapons effects, intelligence photography, polygraph, population and resources control, psychological operations, and raids and searches, riots, special warfare, surveillance, terror, and undercover operations. Asked if the military assistance program ever turned down requests on the grounds that the training of the Brazilians were seeking was inappropriate, Beatty replied, happily, we have never had to. General Beatty asserted that the U.S. Armed Forces advisors who have been closely associated with the host military at all levels of the Brazilian Armed Forces professional training and education maintain strictly apolitical attitudes. On a visit to Brazil in 1971, Richard Barnett had some exposure to these apolitical attitudes. He reported that one high-ranking U.S. military officer with whom he spoke expressed complete satisfaction with the Brazilian regime and suggested that perhaps we're getting to the point in the United States at which some similar strong measures might be necessary. These people understand that sometimes you have to sacrifice a little liberty for the country. If it were to be assumed that the military assistance program in general and the training programs in particular had actually been designed to encourage military submission to civilian authority and to foster democratic attitudes, it would have to be concluded that the means have been monumentally ill-suited to the ends. It has been pointed out, however, that the policy-making process is at best fragmented, and that the more significant policy decisions of interpretation are often at the operational level. It has been argued that the national and transnational institutional self-interest of the military, reinforced by the bureaucratic ethos and the Cold War worldview, weigh heavily on the outcome of interactions between the U.S. military establishment and its Brazilian counterparts. Military programs as their own raison d'etre, however, do not make for imposing rhetoric. Institutional objectives must be viewed and presented as consistent with national objectives. What then are long-term objectives underlying military policy in the hemisphere? Question mark. In 1951, an administration spokesman outlined 4 objectives which military assistance was designed to promote. One is to secure the sources of strategic materials, such as the petroleum fields of Venezuela, the tin mines of Bolivia, and the copper mines of Chile. Secondly, to keep open the lines of access to those strategic materials. Third, to have the armed forces of those countries in readiness to keep the strategic areas defensible from small air and submarine raids from abroad. And fourth, to reduce the call upon our own forces for the defense of those areas. The enemy of that time, in accordance with the Rio Treaty and the Washington consultations of 1951, was assumed to be extracontinental, and the statement had the ring of conventional military alliance strategy. The enemy, however, was not a nation, nor even a group of nations, but an ideology. The perception that was made explicit when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara testified before the Foreign Relations Committee in 1961 of the single threat area, which included all of the Latin American states. McNamara asserted, "Our objective here is to provide the means for local military establishment with the support and cooperation of local populations to guard against external covert intrusion and internal subversion designed to create dissidence and insurrection." If dissidence, defined by Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary as disagreement, presumably with the Cold War worldview, or with U.S. policies, or with government and military establishments supported by the United States, is assumed to be inspired by communism, and if communism is identified as the enemy in a total and perpetual global war, it is easy to understand the apocalyptic view of the inquisitional approach to developments in Latin America and elsewhere. Such an apocalyptic view is expressed in geopolitical terms in Lieutenant Colonel Stockton's analysis of the Brazilian Revolution of 1964. Brazil was carried to the brink of communism, but did not make the tumble thanks to the military. Had the military not acted, and just in the nick of time, the United States would have awakened on the morning of May 2nd, 1964, with Brazil under communist control. That development could have converted Brazil into a China of the Western Hemisphere, presenting the United States with problems of national security dwarfing that of Cuba. Brazil has a contiguous border with every South American country except Chile and Ecuador. She could have exported revolutionaries almost at will. It would have been only a matter of time before all South American countries exploded in people's wars of national liberation. All of the continent would have gone behind the iron and bamboo curtains unless the United States intervened militarily. The objective of securing sources of strategic materials has also far-reaching economic implications. One means of securing such sources is to own them, or is it that must be secured because U.S. companies already own them? Pointing out the U.S. investments in Latin America totaled more than $12 billion, General Porter admonished a New York audience in 1968 to consider the small amount of U.S. public funds that have gone for military assistance and for aid public safety projects, as for a very modest premium on an insurance policy, protecting our vast private investment in an area of tremendous trade and strategic value to our country. Just as the pseudo-religious themes of the divine right of the monarchs and the white man's burden provided justification in the past for the exploits of powerful nations and groups, the Cold War has thrown the cloak of legitimacy over the exploits of contemporary military establishments and those other sectors of the national population whose interests are similar or complementary. However, as the superpowers move towards detente, and as their behavior in both external and domestic affairs shows increasing similarity, the Cold War cliches become ever more transparent. In regard to its military relations with Latin America, the United States has been caught in the bind of having to continue to claim, in the face of amassed evidence to the contrary, that its military programs promote democracy, or to maintain that the communist threat is so overwhelming as to require support for repressive dictatorships, or to come up with some new justification. The Nixon administration appeared to be somewhat at a loss in this semantic game. At the 1969 Senate hearings on U.S. military policies and programs in Latin America, Assistant Secretary Meyer walked into the trap of admitting that counterinsurgency programs were needed to prevent the subversion of the inadequate and inequitable economic and social structures. He then had to retreat and argue that the program should be continued because military relationships between the United States and Latin America have been long-standing. Military strategists, however, are long on ingenuity. The House Special Study Mission reported in 1970 that according to the prevailing view at Southcom, Latin American military men play a major role in national political life, whether or not the U.S. approves, and their views have direct effects on the potential for obtaining U.S. objectives in each country. Hence, the Southcom commander and his staff claim that they are in a position to exert maximum constructive influence on Latin American armed forces, not only in military matters, but in support of political, social, and economic modernization. The mission added that, according to Southcom's General Staff, the U.S. military presence in the Canal Zone serves as credible deterrent to adventurism by radical elements who would be more active in the hemisphere if Southcom did not exist. To Colonel Bobo, detente with the major communist powers produces no dilemma at all. He welcomes it, he has said, because it will allow us to focus on the real problem areas. Our action is in the third world nations. We've already lost our shirts in one war of national liberation. The lead article in the 25th century issue of the Spanish and Portuguese editions of the U.S. Command and General Staffs College Military Review asserted, with the casing of pressures in Southeast Asia, the United States should be able to devote greater attention to the improvement of the inter-American defense forces, as the forces of anarchy, terror, and subversion have selected Latin America as a prime target in the 1970s. And Colonel King asserted that the professional killers and organizations in the U.S. military see Latin America as the war theater of the future. To illustrate the point, he quoted Colonel David Hackworth, who had served 5 volunteer tours in Vietnam and collected 2 promotions and a sackful of medals, as having said, "Well, now I'm going to study Latin American affairs. That's where I'm going next. Because the bastards think that they can win it all now. Yasir Latin America Camus Gay." To combine U.S. Military Advisory Command Latin America, I guess I just like war. Irving Horowitz sees the present situation, the breakdown of neo-colonialism and its replacement with imperial politics of more classic advantage. The present turn to counterinsurgency as a style of politics marks a return to military solutions to economic problems rather than economic solutions to military problems. What has taken place in increasing degrees is the external or foreign management of internal conflicts in Latin America. It has been argued that the geographical expansion of the base of operations is viewed by the U.S. military establishment as an institutional imperative, an imperative made even more salient by competition among the services. And we have seen that just as the assumption of governmental power is in the collective and individual interest of Brazilian military elite, the control of the Brazilian government by the Brazilian military is likewise in the collective and individual interest of U.S. military officers who make and or implement policy towards Brazil. It is not surprising then that the U.S. officers applauded both the coup of 1964 and the super coup of 1968. It appears that the combination of the material interest of the U.S. business community in Latin America and the institutional interest of the U.S. military in areas is so powerful that, even in the face of detente, the virtual elimination of the original rationale for the internal security forces, U.S. military penetration and political reinforcement of local military elites will increase rather than wither if the U.S. military has its way. And so that's the end of that chapter, transnational institutional interest, and defense strategy. So we can see it's pretty straightforward. The U.S. government are a bunch of warmongering, murderous gangsters. They're mafia, warmonger, war criminals. You know, their military used Brazil as a way of selling their defense mechanism, enriching their wallets, enriching their capitalist resources. You know, those capitalist things are all there. They secretly funneled the money in of the oil from Brazil and put it into their, capitalist treasury. And the fascist racists of the United States government, destroyed the Brazilian democracy in the process. The defense attaché, all of these statements indicate that the defense establishment of the United States is incapable of dealing with economic problems and finding economic solutions to military conflicts rather than military solutions to economic problems. They find economic problems to be solved by military murder. That is what they do. They invade places to steal money, and then they solve their economic problem. We want money. We steal the oil from Venezuela or Iran or, Brazil. That is what the United States government is. It is a group of racist, thief, colonial fascists that have no business discussing matters on an international scale. They belong kicked out into a mafia state of nations, not an international league of civilized nations. So we finished actually with the statement. It was very clear here that the idea is that the military, felt that it didn't really matter what the civilians wanted in Brazil. The military wanted a murder machine. They wanted a murder regime. They wanted a place for war. He even said it would be great if we could have war in the future. He said that, basically the last sentence is that the professional killers and organization men in the U.S. military see Latin America as the war theater of the future. So you can see the U.S. is revving up for a Latin American, military murder machine, and that is what they have been doing. So let's continue. Security for whom, part 4, the last part of the chapter. Introduction. We have seen in previous chapters that in the early 1960s, many U.S. policymakers felt that Brazilian national security and, by extension, hemispheric security and U.S. national security were threatened by social unrest and political mobilization in Brazil. In this view, the coup of 1964 and the institutionalization of military rule were seen as victories for security. It has been noted that security is a flexible concept. If it is to be viewed as survival, if it is to be viewed as survival, it is a rather far-fetched argument that the security of the United States was threatened by developments in Brazil in the early 1960s. If security is to be viewed as freedom from fear, then it must be asked, whose fear of what? For the U.S. businessman, the overseas investments, the answer is generally obvious. Freedom from fear of nationalization or of unacceptable limits on his ability to earn a profit. But what of the Brazilian worker who owns nothing? Has he no security interest? Question mark. In these chapters that follow, we attempt to strip away the rhetorical clothing of the security issue and focus upon the balance sheet as it affects real people and institutions here and now rather than hypothetical future wars. That is, we will examine some of the gains and losses flowing in part from the U.S. taxpayers' investment in a secure Brazil. Chapter 14, beneficiaries and victims of the United States penetrative process, or beneficiaries and victims of the penetrative process. Since the beginnings of World War II, Brazil has received more U.S. assistance, both military and economic, than any other Latin American country. That would not be true, of course, on a per capita basis, but since aid is not extended directly to 100 million individuals, per capita calculations merely obfuscate the impact of such aid on internal power balances and consequent allocations of values. In any poor or dependent country, the circle of those whose power positions are directly enhanced by aid to central governments, military establishments, or individuals and groups selected as beneficiaries by the donor country is relatively small. This assistance, in particular the massive transfer of public capital that has taken place since 1964, has consistently been justified by its architects and advocates in terms of the overriding considerations of security. It is reasonable then to ask just whose security has been and is being served. Exact figures as to who is getting what vary considerably, but the trends indicate, regardless of source, are consistent. A report of the Government Operations Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1968 was highly critical of aid operations in Brazil, citing specifically failures in housing, education, and agrarian reform, vagueness in regard to priorities, a reluctance to audit, and aid funding of the importation of luxury items. Nevertheless, aid proposals for fiscal year 1971 included $155 million in development loans and $12.7 million in technical assistance for Brazil, far more in each category than for any other Latin American country. In technical assistance, which includes the public safety program, for example, the nearest competitor was Guatemala, for which $3.65 million was proposed. The amount proposed in development loans for Brazil constituted almost one-third of the amount proposed for all Latin America, including regional programs. The payoff for foreign investors. In the 1971 hearings on U.S. policy and programs in Brazil, Senator Church expressed the opinion that U.S. programs in Brazil had not been particularly effective in accomplishing any of their stated aims, except in providing a favorable climate for U.S. investment. In that area, however, they had been extremely successful. By the end of 1972, U.S. private investment in Brazil amounted to about $2.4 billion. U.S. corporations generally expect their profits from overseas ventures to be at least twice as great as profits from domestic ventures, and in Brazil, they apparently have not been disappointed. U.S. investment in Brazil increased by 71%, 680 million over the decade of the 1960s. Most of this increase, 91%, was financed by reinvested earnings rather than new investments. Meanwhile, profits remitted to the U.S. increased from $5 million in 1964 to $75 million in 1968, and the average return on all U.S. investment ranged from a low of 5.7% in 1963 to a high of 10.7% in 1968. So I'm just going to take a short break. I'm glad you could join us. I'll be back in, about 2 minutes. Glad you could join us. Okay, we'll continue on. Actual earnings cannot be calculated with much precision, as the companies involved naturally report such things in the manner most advantageous to them. And there are countless gimmicks for overestimating costs and underestimating profits. Investment capital is not always registered, and companies organized as limitados, limited liability corporations, as much of the Hana mining company's equity is, are not required in Brazil to publish profits. Furthermore, many entities actually owned wholly or predominantly by Americans are registered elsewhere. The Baskin conglomerate, for example, the largest foreign corporation in Brazil, is registered as Canadian, but 35% of its shares, more than those owned in any other single country, are held in the United States. And the Amazonian estate, the size of Holland, owned by the U.S. shipping billionaire Daniel Ludwig, is listed as Liberian. It appears, however, from the 1969 study by the Fundação Getúlio Vargas that those U.S. companies with investments of more than $5 million tended to show profits much higher than the Commerce Department's averages for the decade. Exxon, for example, with a registered equity of $95 million, reported a profit of 15.7% that year. Johnson & Johnson reported 16%, General Motors and RCA 20%, Squibb 20.5%, Anderson Clayton 21%, Union Carbide 21.8%, General Electric 22.6%, Goodyear and Atlantic Richfield 23%, Texaco 28%, and Xerox 64%. For the decade of the 1960s, profits repatriated to the United States exceeded new capital invested by close to $100 million. Direct new investment from 1963 through 1965 to 1967 was much lower than in 1961, and the outflow of earnings and dividends for that period exceeded all new foreign investment by about $140 million. To that outflow must be added payments for technical assistance, patents, royalties, and the like, which amounted to $170 million in 1967 alone, and interest and amortization payments, which amounted to an outflow of $500 million in 1968. Tied loans meant higher prices for imported goods and some $110 million in 1967 to foreign companies for freight and insurance. In addition to these drains, the central bank estimates that 300 million left Brazil in 1966 and 1967 through illegal remittances. By the end of 1972, Brazil's foreign debt stood at $7 to $10 billion, and the country had become the World Bank's biggest borrower. For more wealth apparently left Brazil, Far more wealth apparently left Brazil in the late 1960s than entered it. One analyst concluded, for example, that about 70% of the income generated by exports went in various ways to the services of foreign capital. The economic dynamism, money changing hands, recorded in the miraculous GNP growth rate, 7 to 9% in the late 1960s, rising to 10 to 11% in the early 1970s, is a reflection of the acceleration of the denationalization of Brazilian industry. By 1970, according to Rio de Janeiro daily newspaper Jornal do Brasil, in the private sector, foreign enterprise controlled 72% of capital goods, 78% of durable consumer goods, and 52% of non-durable consumer goods. Data released by the Brazilian government was cited by Schilling to show that foreign capital controlled 70.3% of the country's 679 largest businesses. Prospects for foreign capital for foreign companies in the 1970s looked even better. The current central bank registered $2 billion in foreign investments in 1970, of which $867 million was registered by U.S. investors. A survey conducted by Business Latin America and 52 leading publicly traded companies, 35 of which have some foreign ownership, showed that in fiscal year 1971, profits soared 64% over the previous year and return on net worth averaged 16%. This average aggregate return on investment, the highest ever recorded in a Business Latin American survey, came during a year when these companies increased their net worth by an average of 28%. Profits from the automobile industry, 100% foreign owned, increased by 128%. General Motors profits, for example, increased 97% to a 32% return on investment. Entire production on also 100% foreign owned. The increase was an even more dramatic 300% for an average return of 30%. Firestone increased its profits by 609% to a return of 50%, and Goodyear had a 114% increase to a 37% return. We have seen that these prosperous companies have shown their gratitude for advantageous policies in the past, or their hopes for a continuation of such advantageous policies, by hiring retired Brazilian military officers. When these same multinational corporations have hired retired U.S. officers, it has generally been explained in terms of defense contracts, but in many cases it might just as easily be seen as a recognition of the contacts and thus influence on economic policy, which these officers exercise with the governing elites in much of the third world. The volume of U.S. investment in Brazil has continued to grow, reaching about $3.5 billion in early 1976. The proportion of Brazilian industry controlled by United States investors has dropped relative to both the shares controlled by multinational corporations based elsewhere and the proportion controlled by the Brazilian government. Thus, Brazil's dependency has been to some extent diversified, and the government has enhanced its ability to regulate the activities of foreign investors. Nevertheless, approximately one half of the country's industry remains under foreign control. The three industries, transportation, chemicals, and machinery, most strongly dominated by U.S. investors, account for more than 2/3 of sales in manufacturing. Multinational corporations have continued to expand their holdings at the expense of independent Brazilian entrepreneurs, and the trend toward oligopolistic control of markets has accelerated. The high cost of imported oil caused an economic setback in 1974 to 1975, and the issue of denationalization continued to be a live one. Representatives of the 65 foreign and multinational firms who met in Brazil in June 1975 explained about all constraints on their freedom of action and expressed strong corporate dislike of the policy of political decompression. In October 1975, President Geisel announced that Petrobras would enter into contracts with foreign oil companies for the exploration and development of offshore oil fields. It was reported in May 1976 that Brazil's Minister of Mining and Energy, Shigeko Uki, said, "My dream is to see Petrobras shares quoted on the New York Stock Exchange." and there were published rumors of pressure to sell the large state-controlled companies of foreign groups as a means of paying the foreign debt. Former Congressman Marcio Moraes Alves remarks upon the humiliation suffered, even by those fortunate enough to be consumers, from foreign domination of the economy. Everything we consume in our daily lives betrays a foreign presence. We are bandaged at birth by Johnson & Johnson. We survive on Nestle or Gloria milk. We dress in synthetic clothes produced by French, British, or American firms. Our teeth are kept clean by Colgate toothpaste and tack brushes. We wash with Lever Brothers and Palmetto soaps, shave with Williams and Gillette. Resting in the sun, we drink Coca-Cola, and now even the largest producer of cachaca, the white rum national drink, is owned by Coca-Cola. We ride Otis elevators, drive Volkswagen and Fords, and ship our goods on Mercedes trucks fueled by Esso and Shell under oil. Our rubber is Pirelli. We talk of Ericsson telephones, communicate through Siemens telex, type on Olivetti machines, and receive IBM processed bills. We eat out of American and Canadian-made cans packed by Armour, Swift, and Wilson. Beatles beats come out of Philips radios, and we dance to RCA records. Our General Electric TV sets are connected to ITT satellites. We can rely only on Bayer for aspirin, or if trouble develops, on Squib for antibiotics. From the comfortable Goodyear mattresses of our American hospital beds, we can look through St. Gobain windows on gardens tended by Japanese lawn owners. If we die, say from lung cancer puffed from British or American cigarettes, we may finally have a chance of entering into our 94% share of the economy. Graveyards are owned by the Santa Casas de Misericordia, an old Brazilian institution, but the family must pay the electricity bills to Canadian Light and Power with money manufactured by Thomas de la Rue or by American Banknote Company. The plight of the Brazilians. This is important information, so please pay attention at this point. President Medici commented in 1970, "The economy is doing fine, but the people aren't." Statistics from virtually all sources tend to bear him out. They reveal that the income of the majority had dropped relatively, and that of an indeterminate but a substantial proportion of the population had dropped absolutely as well. The Brazilian government's own compilation, as cited by 14 bishops and archbishops in the Northeast, show that the top 1% of the population increased its share of the national income from 12 to 17% between 1960 and 1970, while the share of the 50 million Brazilians at the lower end of the scale dropped from 17.6 to 13.7%. Calculations by various scholars demonstrate this great disparity in income distribution. The poorest 80% received only about 27.5% of the national income in 1970 compared to 35% in 1960, while the richest 5% increased its share from 44 to 50%. Every decile of the population except the top one experienced a relative loss of income during that period, and the 45 million at the bottom of the heap had the same total income at the end of the decade as 900,000 at the top. The Gini coefficient of inequality in Brazil's income distribution rose from a modest 0.488 in 1960 to 0.574 in 1960 and 1970, okay, from 0.6488 in 1960 to 0.4574 in 1970, the highest ever recorded at national level in Latin America. Nor was the federal tax system modernized with the assistance of the United States Internal Revenue Service, designed to reverse this trend. Receipts from income taxes decreased from 30% to 26% of the total federal tax receipts between 1961 and 1969. In 1971, the more regressive indirect taxes provided 63% of central government revenues. Furthermore, regional imbalance exacerbated by government politics is such that some have envisioned a future Brazil resembling a little Japan surrounded by a vast India. Regional redistribution of wealth was one of the avowed purposes of the military government's value-added tax. The claim was, however, that the redistribution would be from the richer to the poorer states. The effect has been the reverse. In 1973, Sao Paulo, which produces 35% of the GNP, collected 37% of the nation's total value-added tax for its own use, while northeastern states such as Ceará, which have to import manufactured goods from Sao Paulo, ran into severe deficit on the tax. The government's own cost of living estimates indicate that the percentage of total income spent on food for the country as a whole rose from 40.3% to 41.2% between 1964 and 1970, while the per capita consumption of meat dropped from 41 kilos in 1961 to 39 kilos in 1967. A nutrition study of a sample group of rural workers in the Northeast revealed that they were consuming fewer calories in 1968 than in 1962. The Northeast bishops reported that 3/4 of the 5 million homes in that area had no light water or sewage systems. They also noted that almost 1 child in 5 is stillborn and that half of the babies born in the Northeast die before the age of 5. For the country as a whole, it is estimated that 43% of the deaths of children under 4 years old is from malnutrition. Although the economic boom had exaggerated the already enormous quote-unquote development gap or structure of internal colonialism between the center south and the rest of the country, the majority of the citizens in the booming cities have not fared so well either. In Sao Paulo, for example, infant mortality has continued to rise, reaching 80 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1972. Almost one half of the people from Sao Paulo live in substandard housing. 35% lack running water and 60% lack sewage systems. Per capita monthly income for about half of the Paulistas is $35 or less. Meanwhile, the booming cities have seen a massive increase in such status symbols as pollution and street crime. The incidence of robberies and assault in Sao Paulo more than tripled between 1968 and 1971. Public health care, always sorely inadequate, has seriously deteriorated in recent years. Even though it is estimated that half of the population is infected with tuberculosis and the mortality rate of that disease is the highest in the hemisphere, government expenditure on public health fell by 30% in real terms between 1967 and 1971. The proportion of the federal budget allocated to the Ministry of Health declined from 4.3% in 1966 to 0.99% in 1974, leaving the ministry ill-equipped to combat the epidemic of meningitis that reportedly infected some 27,000 persons and took about 3,000 lives in 1974. The military government has claimed great progress in housing construction, but priority has been given to middle-class housing. As for housing for the very poor, the government points with pride to the fact that with U.S. assistance, it has virtually eradicated the unsightly favelas that used to dot the hills overlooking Rio de Janeiro, transferring the favelados from their makeshift communities to the new complexes, Villa Alancia and Villa Kennedy, built some 30 miles inland from Rio de Janeiro with aid funds, proved to be no easy matter. Community leaders were incarcerated prior to the transfer, and many others had to be handcuffed for the move to their new homes. General Seats, former commander of the U.S. delegation of the JBU-SMC, attributed this reaction to the long hours and costs of commuting and to the general inertia of the poor in developing countries. But there are other possibilities. The author visited some of the favelas in 1964 and thought at the time that, in spite of the general deprivation in which these Brazilians lived, they had something money couldn't buy. One of the most fabulous views in the world, the sweep of the harbor of Rio de Janeiro. That view now being enjoyed by the occupants of luxury hotels and high-rise apartment buildings. The area in which social progress under the military regime has been most demonstrable, quote unquote, has been education. Reported increases in school enrollment have indeed been impressive, especially at the level of higher education, where enrollment has increased by 460% since 1964. However, as a consequence of administrative and curriculum changes, the depletion of the country's best creative and scholarly minds through job dismissals, imprisonment, and exile, and the generally stifling repression of free expression, it appears that what is being billed as education is more akin to a combination of indoctrination and technical and managerial training, stripped of overt debate on economic, socioeconomic, and political issues. U.S. assistance earmarked for education in Brazil had amounted to $187 million between 1965 and 1972. The General Accounting Office, in a report to Congress dated July 30th, 1973, recommended such aid be discontinued on the grounds that U.S. education assistance has directly and indirectly supported Brazil's education development objectives, which are not designed to improve inequities in Brazil's education system. The report went on to state that the decision of both aid and the Brazilian government represented an education policy based solely on economic considerations and not on more equitable distribution of education opportunities within a developing nation. As for the creative arts, even the most subtle suggestion of social criticism in a folk song has on occasion landed its composers and performers in jail. The Sao Paulo Bicentennial of the Arts, prestigious throughout the world in the early 1960s, has become a non-event, and a critic of Brazilian literature noted that while the quantity of publication in the late 1960s was impressive, the quality of these works was the most disappointing he had seen in his 20 years of experience in the field. Meanwhile, E. Bradford Burns has noted that the intellectual sterility of the work by Brazilians available to Brazilians has enabled foreign culture to dominate. More than 70% of all Brazilian television programs are, for example, in the early 1970s, were reruns of U.S. programs dubbed in Portuguese. The group that has suffered the greatest loss of status and income since 1964 has been urban labor. While strikes have been defined as political crimes subject to the death penalty, the real minimum salary by 1970 had dropped from 30 to 38% below that of 1960. And the 1970 census showed that more than 60% of the population earned less than the minimum wage. A survey conducted in Sao Paulo indicated that the worker earning the minimum wage had to work more than twice as long as 1974 as in 1966 to purchase the same staple commodities. Capital-intensive industry has done little to expand employment, and in many cases, new technology has eliminated jobs. A survey of 4 of the technically most advanced and foreign-penetrated sectors indicated that while productivity increased by 128.5% between 1955 and 1966, wages paid to workers increased by only 6.1% in real value in that period. Between 1940 and 1970, the percentage of men over the age of 14 who were employed had dropped from 50.8 to 44.8. In Recife, with a population of 1,100,000, 20% of the labor force was listed as unemployed in 1971, and another 35% was listed as underemployed. Furthermore, the fact that economic growth is being promoted through the expansion of exports rather than through the expansion of internal market has led many to believe that the poor have simply been written off. Celso Furtado, among others, has maintained that income concentration is being promoted deliberately in order to benefit the producers, largely the multinational foreign corporations, and consumers, upper and middle classes of durable consumer goods, and to accelerate the GNP growth rate. Jean-Marc van der Weyden, former president of the UNE, said that one of the most discouraging things he discovered in conversation with workers and peasants who shared prison cells with him was the individualization of deprivation. Massive propaganda had convinced these Brazilians that the country was enjoying great prosperity and that they were isolated in their poverty. Testifying in Senate hearings in 1971, William Ellis, director of U.S. aid mission in Brazil, accredited the improvement in the economy in part to the flexibility and creativity afforded by the government's U.S.-trained economists. He subsequently noted that finance minister could now do by decree things that previously had to go through Congress. The Congress, as then constituted, however, proved to be no problem. In 1971, it approved 100% of the bills introduced by the executive branch. By the early 1970s, the civilian political process had been reduced to a cynical charade. The two official parties were being referred to in private as the parties of Sim and Sim Henner, yes and yes, sir. The government had been fastidious in its attempt to maintain a facade of constitutional government without allowing a critic to slip through its sieve. The new electoral code required that candidates be approved by both an electoral tribunal and a government intelligence apparatus. Furthermore, Institutional Act Number 5, still in effect, gave the president the right to suspend the political rights of any citizen, to decree a congressional recess, and to cancel any electoral terms of office at any level, federal, state, or municipal, of government. Direct elections for president, state governors, and mayors of state capitals, and dozens of cities along the border with neighboring states had been abolished in favor of indirect election or appointment. In fact, most major cities had been declared zones of national security in which no elections of any kind were allowed. Meanwhile, the majority of the electorate has clearly indicated that it recognizes the process for what it is. Voting remains compulsory for literates, and those who refused to participate were subject to severe penalties. Therefore, in the elections of November 15th, 1972, voter turnout was higher than it had ever been before, but blank or nullified ballots outnumbered legitimate ones. This produced some interesting electoral results. For example, in the city of San Sebastián del Lago de Roca in Paribe, an arena candidate ran without opposition and lost. That is, there were more blank or nullified ballots than votes for the sole candidate. In various cities, a significant number of votes were cast for Sugismundo, a government-created cartoon character pushing a nationwide cleanliness campaign. I'm sorry, let me read that sentence again. In various cities, a significant number of votes were cast for Sugismundo, a government-created cartoon character pushing a nationwide cleanliness campaign for a reputed international mafia figure who had been arrested in Brazil, and for Onca Wildcat, a term widely used in colloquial speech as a symbol of arrogance and falsity. And in Salvador, in the state of Bahia, a wildcat named Pitaleca, which had just escaped from the local zoo, polled more than 5,000 votes, beating the candidates of both government and opposition parties. Pitaleca's fate was not unlike that of previous popular choices. 8 days after it won the election, it was captured and killed by the state police. Ambassador William Roundtree testified in the Senate hearings of 1971 that the official count of those deprived of their political rights since 1964 was 1,200, while reporting that the Brazilian government only admitted to holding 500 political prisoners who were common criminals anyway. He conceded that unofficial estimates ranged around 12,000. Some 2,000 Brazilians were said to be living in political exile. Estimates of the number of political arrests since 1964 ranged from some 20,000 to more than 35,000, and estimates of death squad assassinations range from 200 to 300 to some 2,000. Brady Tyson wrote, "It is estimated that some 2,000 prisoners have been physically abused and that between 40 and 120 have been beaten or tortured to death. Furthermore, an undetermined number of leftists, quote unquote, have been officially reported killed by their own comrades, or in the crossfire, or while trying to escape, and many more seem to have simply disappeared and abducted without a trace." In 1974, Amnesty International published the names of 1,081 individuals whose ordeal of torture had been thoroughly documented, and another list of 210 persons whose imprisonment, torture, and disappearance or death at the hands of the Brazilian security forces founded by the United States government had occurred since 1971 only. Fred Morris, a U.S. Methodist missionary and stringer for Time magazine, spent 17 days in the torture chambers of the 4th Army in Recife in 1974 and later reported that he personally knew of some 35 persons who had undergone torture in Recep in the past 4 years, none of whose names appeared on the Amnesty International's list of 1,081. Morris also said that 3 of his torturers, who referred to him as a prisoner of war, told him that they had undergone military training in the United States. The numbers involved, by any estimate, seem small compared to the carnage in Chile since the coup of September 1973. But most observers of contemporary Brazil have not come to the chilling conclusion that the selective use of torture, not only of suspects, but of relatives and friends as well, as a means of squelching dissent by implanting generalized terror, is highly effective. Aside from political office holders and civil servants, repression has fallen most heavily on students and teachers, members of the clergy, labor leaders, writers, artists, scientists, lawyers, and other professionals. Most of the victims of torture have reportedly been in their 20s, but no age, sex, profession, or class has been excluded. First-hand evidence indicates that victims have included children tortured in the presence of their mothers, women in late pregnancy, and elderly priests, nuns, and professors, and lawyers who have had the temerity to represent political prisoners have often found themselves subjected to the same abuses. By the early 1970s, the repression had given rise to a new generation of victims. In 1972, a 17-year-old political prisoner who had been participating in a hunger strike at the Tiradentes prison in Sao Paulo was reportedly transferred to Belo Horizonte's Operacio Bandeirantes and imprisoned in the same torture chamber where he had watched his father die at the hands of the torturers a year earlier. A young Brazilian who preferred not to be named told this author in 1975 that it was not until he had been politically sensitized through association with a small clandestine group of his university and had narrowly escaped arrest that his parents told him they had been active supporters of the goulart government and opponents of the military regime in the 1960s. For his own protection and theirs, they had kept that information from him. The military establishment as a whole has profited greatly from the generalized power of the institution, from the lucrative positions of government and private enterprise formerly held by civilians, and from a defense allocation that more than tripled in constant dollars between 1963 and 1973. The 3 armed forces received 19% of the national budget in 1972, while the social welfare agencies, including health, education, pensions, and land reform, received only 16%. But the advantages accruing to the military have not included freedom of expression. The heavy surveillance experienced by many civilian sectors since the coup has recently moved into the military itself. 20% of the field officers had been removed from their posts for ideologic deviation by 1973. And in 1975, 11 army officers were arrested for studying literature from the Portuguese Armed Forces movement. Hemispheric insecurity in the 70s. And what of the security interests of the United States, ? Responding to the testimony of U.S. Aid Mission Director William Ellis at the 1971 hearings, Senator Church said, "So we have pumped $2 billion since 1964 to protect a favorable climate of investment that amounts to about $1.6 billion. Senator Church found it hard to understand how the exportation of U.S. public and private capital, and thus to some extent the jobs of U.S. workers, and the further enrichment of the big corporation serve the interests of U.S. taxpayers. And for considerations of the global military and political strategies, the military government, for its own reasons, can be counted upon to continue to take a hard line against insurgency anywhere in the hemisphere, but on matters such as territorial waters or the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in the United States, retains little leverage. Having identified itself so intimately with a repressive regime, the U.S. government is virtually bound to continue to support it, as any popular government that might replace it would surely be vehemently anti-American." By the mid-1970s, Brazil's posture of militant anti-communism had been largely confined to internal affairs and to relations with neighboring states. Its relations with most countries beyond the Western Hemisphere were conditioned primarily by the pragmatic considerations of attracting foreign capital, expanding exports, and securing external sources of energy. And the country was defying both superpowers in its insistence on developing its own nuclear power capabilities. Consciously striving for major power status, Brazil opposed any international accord that tended to freeze the contemporary global configuration of power. When the United States and the Soviet Union at the Geneva Disarmament Conference in October 1969 reached an agreement on a draft treaty barring nuclear weapons from the ocean floor, Brazil was the most outspoken critic. Planning Minister João Paulo dos Reis Veloso, addressing the Superior War College in 1970, stressed Brazil's determination not to permit the developed nations to transform themselves into a closed club on the pretext of pollution and disarmament. And a senior diplomat and former foreign minister, speaking at the Brazilian embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1972, accused the superpowers of attempting to institutionalize the inequality between nations. The Military Engineering Institute announced in early 1974 that its nuclear reactor would become operational before the end of the year. It was estimated at that time that by 1980, Brazil would have the capability to build an arms and arm intermediate-range ballistic missiles. In 1975, Brazil's nuclear power agency, Nuclebras, entered into a $4.5 billion agreement with a West German firm for the construction of 8 nuclear reactors. The agreement, which carried few of the controls urged by the United States, includes the provision of the technology and facilities for the production of plutonium necessary for the production of nuclear weapons. The informal triangular alliance of the South Atlantic, Brazil, Portugal, and the Union of South Africa, which had been an important feature of geopolitical strategy in the early years of military rule, had been rendered obsolete by the energy crisis of 1973 and by the overthrow of Portugal's half-century-old authoritarian regime in April 1974. Brazil adopted the Arab stance on the recovery of occupied territories from Israel, condemned Zionism at the UN, and began to expand diplomatic and commercial ties rapidly with Middle Eastern and African states. It also established diplomatic and commercial relations with the People's Republic of China. And during the Angolan Civil War of 1975 to 1976, Brazil recognized the ultimately successful popular movement for the liberation of Angola, while the United States was supporting MPLA's armed adversaries. Brazil's bilateral relations with Latin American states generally parallel those of the United States in both means and objectives. By 1974, Brazil had extended loans tied to the purchase of Brazilian products to most of the Latin American countries. It had also extended technical assistance in various forms and had engaged in joint ventures with most of its neighbors for the development of transportation and communication networks and hydroelectric power facilities. Exports to other Latin American states were growing at the rate of $50 million US annually, and Brazilian capital was being invested in neighboring states to secure a steady flow of raw materials needed for its booming industries. Brazil was obtaining oil and gas from Bolivia, and the two countries were cooperating in the exploitation of Bolivia's enormous Mutun iron ore deposits. Braspetro, the external arm of Petrobras, had reached an agreement with Venezuela's state oil monopoly for joint exploration and exploitation of abandoned fields and offshore drilling, and with Teneco's Colombian subsidiary for joint exploration and the construction of a refinery. Brazil had also arranged to join Colombia in the development of the latter's coal deposits. With Paraguay, Brazil was building a $3 billion hydroelectric power facility, which will be South America's largest, and talks were underway with Ecuador for joint exploitation of Ecuadorian oil. The military government, commanding by far the largest and best equipped armed forces in Latin America, had cultivated close ties with military establishments in neighboring countries. It had cooperated them in a campaign against insurgent movements assumed to be transnational and extended military assistance in the forms of both equipment and training. The development of the Amazon basin, particularly the trans-Amazon and peripheral highway systems, is an important aspect of Brazil's geopolitical strategy for the continent. The nation's policymakers have long feared population spillovers from neighboring countries, and more recently, the military government has seen the vast underdeveloped basin as a potential haven for national and transnational guerrilla groups. In 1973, Colonel Camara Senna, superintendent of the Amazon Development Agency, warned of the danger of moral pollution arising from the chaotic conditions of neighboring countries. In recent years, population spillover has actually been in the opposite direction, and that plus the increasing frequency of military maneuvers in border areas has caused unease among all neighbors. Brazilian settlers have been overflowing the country's borders and purchasing large tracts of lands, especially in Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. It is estimated, for example, that Brazilians own 30% of land in 4 border provinces in Uruguay, and there are more Brazilians than Bolivians living in the Bolivian department of Bando, and some 40,000 Brazilian families have settled on the Paraguayan side of the Parana River. In February 1976, Brazilian Deputy Pedro Loro proposed the annexation of Paraguay to Brazil. The Venezuelan government had decided to move some 3,000 settlers into its Amazon region to counteract exploitation by foreigners. Several members of the Venezuelan Congress have alleged that Brazil is attempting to establish a continental hegemony. And in January 1975, the Caracas evening paper El Mundo claimed to have discovered a secret Brazilian plan to invade neighboring countries if any of the governments go communist. Although the concept of ideologic frontiers, to which Brazil's military leaders have made frequent reference since 1964, has had little application beyond the Western Hemisphere, it has been highly significant in Brazil's relations with its neighbors. The government has taken the position that leftist governments or movements anywhere in the continent constitute a potential threat to national security. It has considered the maintenance of friendly governments in the buffer states of the River Plate Basin essential, and it was particularly alarmed by the radicalism of the government of Juan José Torres in Bolivia in 1970 to 1971, and by the strength of the leftist Frente Amplio broad front that emerged in Uruguay about the same time. Although Chile does not border on Brazil, the government of Salvador Allende was also seen as threatening to Brazilian security, as it had offered asylum to political refugees from other Latin American states. Brazilian complicity was alleged in the military coup d'etat in Bolivia in 1971, Uruguay in 1972, and Chile in 1973. Brazil extended immediate recognition and emergency assistance to the new military regimes. Their president were the only heads of state in attendance at the inauguration of President Geisel in March 1974. By the mid-1970s, it was clear that the regime the United States had nurtured was by no means an all-purpose ally, nor was the ruling elite highly susceptible to U.S. pressures to assume positions that were not in keeping with its own ambitions. Thus far, Brazilian hegemony over its South American neighbors appears to be exercised with the full support of the United States, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger reinforced the general perception in 1976 when he publicly pledged to consult with Brazil on foreign policy initiatives contemplated by the United States. It is at least conceivable, however, that at some point in the not-too-distant future, Brazil's hegemonic role might be seen as competitive or contrary to the interests of the United States. And if a future president of the United States should decide that he or she was serious about urging respect for human rights and economic justice in Brazil, as elsewhere in Latin America, there is no reason to believe that the president would have the unqualified support of even the foreign policy arms of his own government, much less the U.S. overseas business community, in attempting to exert influence in that direction. The term security at its most extravagant reaches must surely relate to an individual or collective state of mind. That being the case, evidence in the form of defense expenditure, arms peddling, and the like suggests that the United States continues to be among the least secure countries in the world in an inadvertent admission against interest. In his 1971 State of the World message, President Nixon warned that the difficulties facing U.S. policy in Latin America will grow rather than diminish as the decade unfolds. As for the ruling clique in Brazil, continued waves of political arrests indicate that it still does not feel secure. In August 1972, O Estado de Sao Paulo, a marked departure from the caution generally displayed by all the information media, questioned why the frequency of arbitrary arrests should be even greater at that time than at the height of the incidents of political kidnappings and other such revolutionary acts. By 1976, the hopes had been aroused by President Geissel's promises of political decompression and by the electoral victory of the MDB in the November 1974 congressional elections had been soundly dashed. Waves of arrests through the last half of 1975 had been provoked in particular by the military command's fears of internal subversion on the Portuguese model and by actual or anticipated criticism of economic policies. The death, apparently by torture, of noted professor and journalist Vladimir Herzog, one of at least 200 persons arrested in Sao Paulo during the week of October 15, unleashed the largest spontaneous protest demonstration the country had seen since the revolution. This in turn provoked the closing of universities, the removal of elected officials, and exhortations of the armed forces' unity. At the level of the unavoidable minimal definition of security survival, it appears that the individual U.S. citizen in Latin America is less secure than ever. The rioting provoked by the Rockefeller tour, the kidnapping of Elbrick, and the killing of Dan Mitrione are among the cases in point. And those U.S. citizens who are not likely to be targets for insurgents are suspect to the U.S.-backed military governments. Professor Joe Page, for example, was arrested in Recife shortly after the 1964 coup. The cases of 3 U.S. scholars, 2 priests, 2 freelance photographers, and 1 girl with dual citizenship, all who had been arrested by Brazilian authorities in 1968 and in some cases treated roughly, were discussed in the Senate hearings in 1971. It is alleged by a former Peace Corps evaluator and denied by the State Department that a volunteer was arrested in the late 1960s and charged with subversive activities. Fortunately for the volunteer who had just recently arrived, his Portuguese was so poor that interrogation proved exasperating to the police, and he was released and allowed to leave the country. Many additional cases appeared in the press in the early 1970s, including the arrest in 1973 on charges of subversion of the Brazilian wife of a member of the U.S. aid mission and the torture of Fred Morris in 1974. As for the Brazilians, one U.S. journalist in Brazil was told that the poor are dying of hunger and the rich are dying of rage. The individual, assuming that he can provide for his physical needs, is secure only so long as he is not suspected of being unsympathetic to the military regime or having unsympathetic friends or relatives. So that's an excellent chapter, beneficiaries and victims. Beneficiaries are the U.S., racist thieves, the racist thieves of the United States capitalist elite, and their U.S. Congress and their Treasury are the beneficiaries of the Brazilian coup. They are racist thieves and racist murderers, racist exporters and warmongers, racist war criminals. That is what the United States government, its Congress, and its presidents are. We saw all of the capital. They were just extracting out the resources, just siphoning out all the resources from the country. They were just taking out all of the natural resources, just moving it into Washington. None of the local people got any money. They were all hungry. They were stuck with Coca-Cola. One guy gives a nice statement about the fact that we have Coca-Cola. We have, basically we have Coca-Cola. We have nothing. We have just Coca-Cola. We have Palmolive. We have, Gillette. We have TikTok brushes, Colgate toothpaste. Everything we dress up is in British, French, and American firms. Johnson & Johnson, the racist Western governments of Europe and the United States formed together again an alliance of racist subverters of democracy, racist promoters of fascism and racist hegemony, and the United States government warmonger butchers, promoted, basically a genocide against the Brazilian people. It was a genocide of the peasants of Brazil. We saw all of the different things, hemispheric insecurity in the 70s. We discussed all of the fact that, the nuclear weapons of the United States, their nuclear armed rogue state, the racist rogues of the United States and the mafia, criminal gangsters with nuclear weapons of Washington, D.C., continue to, push its nuclear power across the world. We talked about that South African strategy. They changed after the energy crisis of 1973. And then Portugal's regime was overthrown, allowing Brazil to take sides with the People's Republic of China, with, to oppose the Zionist regimes of the United States and Israel, and to promote the South Atlantic, basically the alliance of, diplomatic relationships with Middle Eastern and African countries. The United States was discouraging African communications, whereas Brazil changed that because of the energy crisis precipitated by the U.S. racist thieves and white fraud capitalists and its white lying media. And then the final thing was the ruling clique. We talked about, basically ideology. It's all ideology. Again, everything is very well described in this book, but it is basically the United States government is not able to discuss or openly debate. It is not able to allow for free competition. It is a racist group of military murderers. They are military fascists. They promote colonial fascism in any of their lands, and this is what they did in Brazil. They promoted a colonial fascist regime and, pushed the fascist, principles of no democracy, only military dictatorship, machine gun government. We always describe the United States actions across the world as a machine gun group of mafia, war criminal butchers. That is what you should always remember. And then finally, we also discussed the jailing of professors and journalists. Vladimir Herzog was jailed in October 15th, 1975, due to the Portuguese model and the criticism of the economic policies of the military judges. He was jailed. The typical thing: jail the scholars, jail the scholarly people, jail the people who read the books, who produce the information on, publicly available, media. This is the United States. It is a group of fascist, racist thieves, racist thieves, and fascist, promoters of, military dictatorship and machine gun government. That is what we are in store. So that's chapter 14, and we're going to finish up with chapter 15. It's only 8 pages, so I'll be done really fast. It's the conclusion chapter, so please pay attention here. Uruguayan journalist Eduardo Galeano charged that Brazil's 1964 coup was the product of conspiracy financed by the United States, the inevitable result of a dependent country challenging the influence of an imperialist power. It is at once logical and absurd that the only Latin American government which tried to bring into practice the principles contained in the Charter of Punta de Este, which gave birth to the Alliance for Progress, should fall destroyed precisely as a victim of a conspiracy which the United States financed. As it unmasked the hypocrisy of the Alliance for Progress, the fall of Goulart confirms an old conviction of the left wing. No dependent country situated in imperialism's sphere of influence can set out to create a policy of industrialization and national development. Inevitably, the necessary structural changes will be considered challenges to stability of the imperialist power and to the security of the native ruling oligarchy. Whether old Gope Comico in Washington, the coup began in Washington, as one Brazilian book title proclaims, may never be known, and in fact may not be knowable, as a convergence of interest has many sources and many beginnings, and the variables cannot be isolated in order to determine which constituted the necessary and sufficient causes. We have no incontestable proof on the order of public admission by top-ranking officials that the United States government adopted a policy of destabilizing, quote unquote, the constitutional government of Brazil and contributing to its demise in 1964. It is to be hoped that future congressional investigations and scholarly research will produce a more detailed and systematic account of the nature and consequences of the United States' influence in Brazil in the 1960s, as well as the extent to which the pattern of penetration described in this case study has been replicated in Chile and elsewhere in the hemisphere. We have seen, however, that Brazil's residence in the United States sphere of influence generated the high level of dependency and the associational links that led to important groups of Brazilians to see their own interests as dissociated from or contrary to the interests of the majority of their countrymen, or to define the national interests in terms outlined by the United States rather than by the national community and as imperfectly expressed by the electorate. We have seen that U.S. officials had been concerned in 1961 that Quadros might be vulnerable to communist influence, and that when Goulart assumed the presidency, the mood among virtually all U.S. officials, civilian and military, involved in analyzing Brazilian politics and in making a policy toward Brazil at the time turned to panic. In the absence of incontestable proof, this author nevertheless finds the weight of the evidence persuasive that the United States anticipated the coup of 1964, encouraged it, intervened covertly, and was prepared to intervene overtly with arms and even troops had it appeared that the conspirators faced defeat. Evidence cited in support of this argument has included numerous allegations from sources with widely varying interests that Brazilian business groups, state governors, and military conspirators had been promised or led to believe that if they declared a state of rebellion and ran into trouble, they could count on the United States for assistance. We have noted various indications of close contact and of shared interests and fears among U.S. officials and the Brazilian conspirators, and we have the acknowledgement of a few U.S. officials that their agencies or clients participated or contemplated participation in that supposedly domestic conflict. Although it has not been possible to verify accuracy of each allegation, the general pattern of support for the conspirators seems clear. Furthermore, it is not necessary to confirm direct United States complicity in the coup itself in order to conclude that the United States' actions contributed to the success of the conspirators, because we have seen that the United States had been engaged in a long-term effort to weaken the leftist, nationalist, or populist movement and to strengthen the opponents of that movement. Johann Galtung observed in A Structural Theory of Imperialism that the only imperfect imperialism needs direct violence. The process whereby the elite of poor countries is lured or coerced by the state of dependency upon, and ultimately, in many cases, a convergence of interests and values with the elite of a hegemonic power is an ongoing one. If the system is in good working order, the hegemonic power should be able to meet a perceived threat to its interests through more or less covert assistance to already dependent local elite groups. Armed occupation by the hegemonic power indicates a breakdown in the penetrative process. The denationalization of key elite groups in Brazil has been well underway since World War II. Through the infusion of funds, economic and military assistance, and private investment, and the concomitant briefcase brigades, U.S. links with various important sectors of the society, particularly with the armed forces and the industrialists, had been expanded and intensified. It has been argued that in the early 1960s, there was an accelerated effort cloaked in the euphemisms of the Alliance for Progress to strengthen these linkage groups, to alienate them from the attitudinal trend of the majority of the national community as expressed in elections, and to use them along with other devices such as the external credit squeeze to hasten the demise of a constitutional government. As U.S. investment already amounted to more than $1 billion by 1981, businessmen linked to the multinational corporate structure were natural allies. We have seen that some of these businessmen formed an organization called the Institute for Research and Social Studies, IPES, to agitate and later to conspire against the government of Goulart. IPES was one of the groups that had reportedly met with Ambassador Lincoln Gordon and came away confident of U.S. help. if needed. A more shadowy organization known as the Brazilian Institute for Democratic Action, IBAD, by its own admission, pumped the equivalent of some $12 million into the 1962 congressional and gubernatorial election. IBAD was outlawed in 1963 after a Brazilian Congressional Investigation Commission uncovered circumstantial evidence that its funding came from foreign sources. And more recently, a former CIA agent has confirmed that IBAD was a CIA political action operation. These organizations flooded the communications media with scare propaganda, but an even more serious threat to the integrity of the media was the fact that most of the companies that could afford to advertise were U.S. owned, and all of the major advertising agencies were periodicals that took pro-labor or nationalistic stands, were thus denied advertising and driven out of business. We have seen that the U.S. officialdom was particularly panicked by the peasant unrest in the Northeast. In 1962, the U.S. and Brazilian governments signed the Northeast Agreement involving a commitment of $131 million. Several observers concluded that the program's two interrelated purposes were to defeat leftist candidates and to suppress or co-opt the peasant movement. Aid was supposed to work through the superintendency of the Northeast, but Sudin objected to aid strategy. Undermining Sudin then became one of the principal purposes of the aid program. The penetration of labor was to be accomplished through the American Institute for Free Labor Development, a bedfellow arrangement of labor management and government aid and CIA established in 1961. It has been noted that in the fall of 1963, AIFLD's executive director met with the governor of Sao Paulo and was briefed on plans for the coup. AIFLD then arranged a training session in Washington for a special all-Brazilian group. After the coup on one AIFLD official boasted in a radio interview that AIFLD trainees had been involved in the conspiracy. By the mid-1963, the U.S. effort to undermine Goulart had been formalized in the so-called Islands of Sanity policy. Under this policy, aid to the central government was suspended, while more than $100 million was committed to state governors who were pro-U.S. and anti-Goulart. The Public Safety Assistance Program was apparently geared at the time to the Islands of Sanity policy because most of the policemen trained in 1963 were from the states of Minas Gerais, Guanabara, and Sao Paulo, whose governors were central figures in the conspiracy, and the largest sum ever expended on the program in Brazil was expended in 1964. Nevertheless, the momentum of the leftist nationalist direction of development was such that it appears that these countervailing forces might have been isolated and contended with save one. Short of violent revolution, a hypertrophied, at least in terms of role and self-image, alienated military establishment cannot simply be cut off from national community by the civilian leaders. Its link with the community is broken only when it assumes control of the government and cuts the civilians out. We have seen that the Sorbonne faction, which spearheaded the coup, was the faction that had been cultivated by the United States ever since World War II. A high proportion of its members fought alongside U.S. troops in the Italian campaign. These officers staffed the Superior War College, ESG, which the U.S. military had helped to establish and operate, and they had been trained in the United States. The Cold War worldview to which they were exposed had made them contemptuous of politicians and suspicious of those who advocated social reform. And extensive training in systems analysis, managerial skills, and the like had convinced them that they were the only group capable of governing. It has been noted that in the face of Brazilian crisis of 1964, there was an extraordinary degree of coordination among agents of the United States government and businesses. But that was the fruit of all. What was the fruit of all those efforts? ? Certainly, a number of the country's most important civilian politicians, in particular those state governors favored by the Islands of Sanity policy, had joined the conspiracy against Goulart. But United States efforts to tilt the political balance through electoral economics had yielded a mixed bag. Miguel Arias was elected governor of Pernambuco despite the efforts of the United States to defeat him, despite the propaganda and campaign funding provided by IBAD, IPES, and related organizations. The PTB gained strength in the elections of 1962, and the Congress restored full presidential powers to Goulart in 1963. AIFLD boasted of having drawn a number of labor leaders into the conspiracy against Goulart, but it is doubtful that AIFLD can take much credit for the ineffectiveness of the labor movement as a whole at the time of the coup. Aid and other United States agency in the Northeast had succeeded in undermining Sudan, but despite all their efforts, the peasant movement had not been contained or de-radicalized. We do not know whether such a coup would have occurred and whether the military regime would have become so firmly entrenched if the United States' position in 1964 had been neutral or opposed to the conspiracy. It has been shown that civilian political structures was poorly equipped to cope with economic stress and with interclass conflict. Certainly, there were individuals and groups whose inclinations and self-interest would have favored the toppling of the Goulart government, regardless of United States policy in that particular instance. But would they have been so strong or so bold without United States support? It is apparent that contenders on both sides anticipated civil war. Would those on the right, clearly outnumbered in the overall clash of interests, have been willing to risk armed confrontation without the expectation of United States backing? Celso Furtado, for one, doubts it, and so does this author. Colonel Vernon Walters, defense attaché in Brazil, and at that time subsequently deputy director of the CIA, had served as liaison between the U.S. and Brazilian troops in Italy and had developed a close friendship with Castelo Branco and others in the Sorbonne group. Furtado maintains that Walters served as a focal point of communication among military conspirators who were hesitant at first to commit themselves, and that the assurance of U.S. backing was important in strengthening their resolve. We have seen that the long-term linkages and short-term tactics of the United States in civilian sector contributed to the disaggregation of the state and the polarization of the national community that facilitated the overthrow of the Goulart government. But efforts to shift the political balance in the civilian sector had only frustrated the reformist policies of the government. The leftward trend of the electorate and the mobilization of the lower classes, they had not reversed them. So the most crucial target of U.S. influence was the military. To paraphrase Nelson Wernick Soder, while the background accompaniment was certainly useful, the orchestra on the final analysis was reduced to a single instrument. We do not know that the Brazilian military's conception of its political role would not have expanded, or that the mental image of political opponents would not have transformed into the dehumanized enemy image without United States influence. But we do know that the massive weight of U.S. influence was on the side of those developments. As James Kurth expressed it, the United States really chose to pull the trigger. The role of the United States military aid program in Latin American politics is like the role of one soldier out of the several who form a firing squad. A soldier in the firing squad who shoots a civilian may defend himself with the argument that the victim would have been shot by the other soldiers anyway, or that his own bullet was not the first to hit the mark. And it is true that the important point about the civilian is that he would still be dead. But the important point about the soldier and about the United States policymaker is that he chose to pull the trigger. While denying any role in the coup itself, the United States did not deny the massive dollar transformation in the years following. It were intended to strengthen the revolutionary government, and U.S. spokesmen have effectively praised Brazil's economic miracle and its stability. The country has indeed exhibited political stability, but it is a stability imposed through terror. A number of Brazilians who have been subjected to torture have claimed that the torturers were trained by the United States, that Americans were present in their interrogations, or that United States equipment was used. The United States Military and AIDS Public Safety Division, of course, have denied any involvement in this messy business. But whether or not any of the inspiration for or methods of torture can be traced to United States torture, the issue to United States sources, The issue pales to insignificant beside the contributions of these agencies acknowledge and in fact boast of. Torture is one of the oldest techniques of political repression known to man. No country really needs the help of the United States to institute it, but the provision of the most advanced technology in transportation, communication, and identification, of the latest equipment for crowd control, and of managerial expertise is another matter. Brazil could hardly have established the network of political surveillance it now commands without the United States' assistance. It is discomforting that in reporting to the Senate in 1971 that the provision of United States public safety advisors to Brazil was to be terminated. Ambassador Roundtree said that this discontinuance was possible because the purposes of the program have largely been accomplished. There can be little doubt that continuing United States assistance, whether bilateral channeled through the supposedly multilateral agencies, strengthens the immediate oppressors of the Brazilian people. But it would be naive to assume that a cutoff of this assistance would undo the damage that has been done, that it could open the floodgates of liberation from militarism and exploitation. The infusion of funds does not reduce the interaction process to simple bribery, nor, for that matter, to complex bribery. Bribery implies transactions with precise objectives in a limited time frame. And while some of the linkages in this case have probably been of that nature, a great many more have been of long-standing and more subtle and more pervasive. These should be of greater concern to the individuals and groups of the so-called third world who strive to turn the tide of the corruption and exploitation of their peoples by the forces spawned in the overdeveloped world. Every empire has had its Hordian class, but the spread of the modernization process and the general shrinkage of the world have led, in the space of a few decades, to an unprecedented diffusion of the values of the most highly industrialized Western states and the absorption or near suffocation of less aggressive cultures. If the denationalization process with which we are dealing reflected merely a grasping for status and personal gains, it would be bad enough. But the malignancy goes much deeper. Marx granted that the upper classes, in their determination to preserve a system from which they benefited, were not driven merely by greed. Rather, their actions flowed from the projection of their own value systems as universals. So it appears that the Uruguayan writer Jose Enrico Roda was right all along. It was not the conquest of Latin America's natural resources by the Colossus of the North that he warned his countrymen against at the turn of the 20th century, but the conquest of its soul by materialism. I see no good, Rodo said, in denaturalizing the character of a people, its personal genius to impose on its identity with a foreign model. Those without rank or fortune ineffectually imitate only the foibles of the mighty. And little wonder, because it has been precisely the foibles rather than the victims, the sleaziest side of the national character of the United States that have governed relations with Latin America and that have increasingly been fed into the larger international system. And increasingly, the American people have reaped at home what they have sown abroad. In the troubled year of 1973, Senator Hubert Humphrey said, "There is a familiar maxim that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The admonition applies to both nations and individuals. With Watergate, we have seen officials of our government commit criminal acts that strongly resemble the practices and methods directed against foreign governments and other peoples. Counter-espionage, cover-ups, infiltration, wiretapping, political surveillance, all done in the name of national security in faraway places, have come home to haunt us. The spirit and the purpose of domestic policy is said to condition our foreign policy. The reverse is also true. Watergate is but a boomerang. If this process of denationalization cannot be reversed, perhaps, as Dom Helder Camara says, the hope for the underdeveloped world lies in the transformation of the developed world. Ironically, the legions of intellectual elites driven from their own countries in the United States by repressive regimes supported by the United States might help to speed the process of conscientiazo in the metropolis. Meanwhile, back in Brazil, to borrow the language of E. Bradford Burns, atop a high hill dominating the quiet waters of Botafogo Bay in Rio de Janeiro stands a giant Coca-Cola sign. Blinking rhythmically in the evening air, it casts a bright reflection across the waters to taunt the Brazilians, reminding them that so much of their present culture is being imported, that so much of their genius is being suppressed, that so much of their originality is being discarded. Throughout 1972, as the celebrations of Brazil's independence continue, the bands blare martial music, flags flutter, patriotic oratory resounds, and the Coca-Cola sign flashes its silent mockery through the long Brazilian night. So that's the whole book. The whole book, United States Penetration of Brazil, Jan Knapper's Black. Excellent, excellent book. What did we find out in the end? We found out in the end that the United States is guilty of the, coup of the Brazilian government. It was meant to steal the natural resource, to steal the oil and all of the other natural resources, put it in the white racist capitalist hands of the United States government, and basically throw the Brazilian people to the dogs. Basically, they threw the Brazilian people to the dogs. They inflated the American people, to the reaping of the rewards of their, basic racist theft in the land, their racist theft and enslavement of the Brazilian people. They reaped those rewards and threw the Brazilian people to the dogs. He said very clearly here that basically the oppressors, the immediate oppressors of the Brazilian people, the United States, are the immediate oppressors of the Brazilian people, working through the Brazilian generals. So that is one thing that we learned. We also found that, despite U.S. denial is just commonplace. They deny everything, no matter whether they torture, no matter whether they murdered somebody. It is just nonstop denial. They are just that way. They are racist liars. They are propagandists, deliberate liars. That course for fabrication that force for fabrication shows very clearly that they're much interested in just denying, to just say that we didn't do it, it wasn't us, we didn't do it, just like they do all the time. It wasn't us. We were not responsible for this. It was just, it just happened. It just happened. They are just racist liars. They are liars, propagandists, deliberate fabricators. Their journalism reflects their honesty and their lack of ethics. Everything also, shows their human rights abuse. They are human rights abusers. They are torturers. They promoted torture in Brazil. They promoted the Brazilian people to be tortured by the U.S. government, and then they deny that they did so. They deny that they provided the equipment, the extensive training to the torturers in Brazil, and the torturers were all over the place. It says very clearly that the United States equipment was used in the torture. The torturers were trained by the United States. Many of the Brazilians who were actually tortured came out and gave testimonies of the United States complicity and actual presence in their torture sessions. So this is clear. The U.S. government is a bunch of mafia war criminal butchers. They are war criminal mafia butchers, warmongers of the United States. They go everywhere to steal the oil and natural resources, leave the people to nothingness, leave the people to just oppress poverty, and then walk away and say, we didn't do anything wrong. Someone needs to call out the United States government for the racist lies, for the racist theft, for the racist mass murder campaigns, and the war criminal butchers of the United States government. And that's pretty much all that we see in the whole book. It's an excellent book, and I strongly advise you to download the book. It will be in the description section of the website, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I will be back tomorrow with a book by Noam Chomsky, Post-War Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology. So we're going to finish. We would like to discuss key certain concepts of the chapters we have reviewed recently. We discussed 3 chapters of the U.S. and Brazilian military elites, institutional ambient of the military, and implications of the Cold War worldview. We learned about the gun-violent American white war criminal murderers who supported police brutality training in Latin America and provided the appropriate torture techniques to the Brazilian military to severely repress the population. This was because the fascist American machine gun murder war criminals could not accept civilian supremacy in Brazil. They needed a close-knit group of military elites to provide them with free capital of the Brazilian resources and to prevent the Brazilian people from furthering democracy and preventing military machine gun government. The United States military is known for its inability to accept civilian or popular democratic opinion. It has over and over acted as judge and jury in lands in which it has not been solicited and never allowed debate or civilian discussion for the sake of betterment of the country's problems. The U.S. police, brutal white American terrorists, are agents of its military establishment and are responsible for major subversion in Latin America. They were intricately involved with police training programs, including those which were used to infiltrate the civilian state governments of Brazil and resulting in a coup of the federal government of Goulart. The state governments very much were pushing for reform for the Brazilian people, whereas the U.S. terrorist police, white murderers, felt that it is fascist machine gun government that the Brazilian people deserve. This is, as they have always been, a group of racist white technocrats and machine gun violent fascists who do not involve themselves in discussions with civilians and are simply agents of racist violence against the people's best interests. The racial profiling manual was discussed in the U.S. Marine Corps Small War Manual. They also furthered the ambitions of a few military elites who were not interested in the people, but were interested in the self-serving interests and very loyal to the racist white rapists and murderers of the United States Congress, who were interested only in stealing Brazilian money through its resources without giving them any returns. The economist Celso Furtado made clear that the Brazilian military generals were being indoctrinated with American fascist colonial military security doctrine which is highly murder prone because the whites of American Congress are highly violent murderers. The indoctrination put forth that the military are to view themselves as the sole political entity and to not accept any civilian political party as valid. And anyone who is against or dissent against the small-minded white murderers of Washington's formula for economy in Brazil were shot dead by the gun-violent Americans and their Brazilian military fascist murderers. Political debate and open competition were not allowed by the American murderous war criminals, as they do not allow these things in order to have a complete machine gun control of the society. They lied and peddled propaganda that democracy at work was the goals of the U.S., while the power and opulence of the U.S. military was stressed, pushing the military away from civilian discussions of the consensual process of genuine debate and competition in democratic societies. General Seitz was chairman of the American delegation for the JBU-SMC and was in favor of the coup because Goulart was a communist. He was again lying, as most American advisors indicated that Goulart was not a communist but posed a threat to U.S. interests due to his nationalization of oil goals. Every democratic popular call for reform conjured up the Cold War psychology of communism, and that only military people who are immune to the vagaries of civilian politics could discipline the economy, populace, and achieve economic development. Thus, the U.S. machine gun white murderers and war criminal fascists were not at all in the democratic arena in Brazil, but were 100% a fascist dictatorship. The number of political murders is a testament to the U.S. blatant disregard for human rights of third world Brazilians, many of whom were starved or imprisoned or murdered by United States policies. This irrational communist obsession kept the Brazilian people in a state of terror for the duration of the dictatorship. The communist worldview was shown by Black in the book to result in the devastation of Brazil's economy, the gun-violent fascist American military war criminals, and its theft of the Brazilian resources of oil and denationalization, which they prevented from reversing and resulted in the racist white American capitalist economic failure in Brazil. So that's it. I'm glad you were able to join us today. United States penetration of Brazil, Jan Knapper's Black. Have a great day. I'll be back tomorrow with After the Cataclysm. It's a book by Noam Chomsky, Post-War Indochina, and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology. Have a great day. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach.